Bonjour, everyone. My name is Kieran LaMarche. I am a senior principal scientist at Thermo Fisher in our CM group. And today I'm going to be talking about some of the way we're using models in part of our control strategy. So we actually have several things we want to talk about. I want to give you a little overview of Thermo Fisher and our CM program there. I want to talk to you about our direct blend encapsulation process and how we run it, and talk to you a bit about, again, our models and how they're part of our control strategy. So Thermo Fisher Scientific, formerly Patheon, is a CDMO for pharmaceuticals. We're one of the largest. We began our continuous manufacturing program in 2014, and we're on track to become the first CDMO filed with a continuous process for direct blend encapsulation line. What we're trying to do at Thermo Fisher is build a highly flexible, modular, continuous system. Excuse me. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, there we go. One last thing. We're doing this all at our continuous manufacturing site in Greenville, North Carolina. So why are we so interested in a highly flexible modular line? Because we're a CDMO, we expect to have a lot of different customers come in with very different projects, very different needs. We want to be able to meet their needs in a flexible and efficient manner. We also want to be able to react to changes in development. It's not uncommon for a drug in development stage to go through a change in drug load. So, for example, you could be at a 10% drug load and then suddenly be at a 50% drug load. We need to be able to react to that in an efficient way to make sure we can hit our timelines. So we want to be able to take different pieces of our equipment and plug them together in different ways to meet our clients' needs. We want to do this all in the same manufacturing space. So in our system, we have things like our feeder and blender system as a unit. We have our tablet presses and encapsulator, our granulation systems. We have both high shear granulation and drying and dry granulation available. And we can take them, break them apart, move the pieces around, put them together again. And that's difficult or challenging, I would say, not only from an equipment point of view, but also from a control strategy point of view. We need to be able to take our control strategy and have it be flexible enough to handle those changes in the equipment. But our first thing we're really working on is getting this continuous encapsulation line up and running for our client. We are also working with a lot of different PAT capabilities. So we have both NIR and Raman available, but we're also using real-time process models in a sort of PAT context. But first, let's talk about the direct blend encapsulation line. So why capsules? Not only is this something our clients are interested in, but this is a product that is used frequently. Many products start off as capsules in early development. They can be better for pediatric formulations. Patients can take them, open them up, and deposit the drugs into something the children will eat. Some patient populations just prefer them. So they are the second most popular form of OSD on the market, and something that our client that we're working with was very interested in making it a continuous line. The issue here is that they're a bit more complex than traditional tableting. The machines have to handle the individual capsules and fill them, and that can mean there's a lot more to go on dynamically with the systems, which poses a challenge for a continuous system. So some design considerations when working with an encapsulator. First thing is mass throughput. The throughput is simply the total amount of material that's flowing through your line, or the total rate at which the material flows through your line. And the minimum capacity of a line is usually set by the capability of your feeders. So for your minor components, you are going to want to have them fed in a controlled manner. And the slower you end up running your feeders, the less data they're getting on the scale over time. So you end up just sprinkling your minor components in at slow rates. That means your feeders are going to be less accurate. So you really want to have a fast enough throughput that you can keep your feeders in the right range. So rule of thumb, you're talking about 15 kilograms an hour right now as being kind of the minimum throughput you want to look at for a line. The other issue here, so you set a minimum throughput you can run. The capsules tend to have a much lower fill weight than a typical tablet. So tablets will be something like 400 milligrams. Capsules are closer to 50 to 100. In that case, you're talking about if you have a smaller unit, you need more units to make the same mass flow rate. So that means a relatively small tablet press, 18 stations, will have a similar throughput to a very, very large encapsulator with something like 200,000 capsules an hour. So 2,100 capsule an hour encapsulator is about the biggest you can find on the market right now. So we need to go from a relatively small tallow press to meet our line needs to a very, very large encapsulator just because of the difference in the weight of the units. So we've got ourselves a very large encapsulator. It's got a range of 100,000 to 200,000 caps an hour. It's a dosator style encapsulator, so it's using dosators to pick up the powder and deposit them into the capsules. It's got a built-in capacitance weight sensor system. So this is a very important part for capsules. Typically, encapsulated products have to go through a separate weight checking step. So they'll take the high weight capsules, low weight capsules, and divert them. That can be difficult from a continuous line. That means another piece of equipment to be incorporated in the line. If that can be incorporated into the encapsulator itself, it does make things a lot simpler. The way this unit makes so many capsules an hour is as 2 turrets of dosators that are running in parallel to create all the capsules. But because it's such a large piece of equipment, it has a large internal holdup, or just the total amount of mass that's held in the system is quite large. But let's look a little bit at how powder flows through the system. So powder comes in through the top. It goes into this large hopper at the top, circled in red. The powder flows from there through 2 screws, then into bowls, and the bowls are where the dosators dive into the powder, pick up the powder, and then put it into the capsules. So this is a schematic of what that looks like. So you can see the geometry of the top hopper. It looks a little bit like a top hat. Powder fills that top hat to a certain flow, goes out of these little ports on the side into the screws that take them down to the bowls. So this machine here, it can hold an enormous amount of powder compared to our normal direct blend tabulating line. So we're talking about 3 to 8 kilograms for the common hopper. The bowls are smaller, about 1.5 kilograms each. So you can have as much as 14 kilograms in this one piece of machine. To put that in perspective, a direct tabulating line can have about 3, maybe 5 kilograms in the entire line. So this is just one piece of equipment that's several times larger than that. And that has an impact on how the whole machine operates. So when you have a larger amount of material in your line, it's going to respond slower to a given change. One way to test the line is to look at the RTD, or the residence time of material inside of it. A simple test to do that is called a step change experiment. So here we take the feeders, we change their set point from a steady 20% drug load to a 30% drug load, and watch the amount of time for that change to happen inside the system. Because there's so much material inside the line, it takes time for that material to be replaced by the new drug coming in. And when the new drug is totally replaced everything else that's inside of it, that's when you reach your new steady state. So you can see here we have 35 minutes to 40 minutes worth of time to change that system over with. So that's a very long time compared to a direct blend line, which is closer to 5 minutes. So you can have a long transition time, and that can be difficult for control because things will take a long time to travel through your entire system. It also means that you have to deal with potentially large deviations in how much the material has to be rejected by the system. So some other considerations, shell handling issues can be frequent. So the encapsulator has to take shells, the empty shells, open them up, orient them, fill them, close them again, and bring them outside of the machine. That can be difficult if anything happens to those capital shells. If any of them are crushed in shipping and they come into the machine, they can start causing problems. That means the machine will either slow down or stop because of the issues. And a continuous line having frequent stops can be difficult from a controls perspective. You really want to keep everything running at a nice steady rate. The large holdup also makes disturbance rejection difficult. So if you have a continuous line and you have feeders that occasionally will have an issue, you want to be able to reject material that is at the wrong concentration for your control system. For a large line, that means we can have a very long rejection time. So if feeders step out, because the system responds so slowly, it can be a long time for that material to leave. So this is true for any large piece of equipment, dryers, coaters, example. We use process models here as a potential solution for that issue. So let's talk a little bit about real-time process models as PAT tools. So what's a process model? Here we're using mass balance systems to make predictions of how the concentration changes within the system. And this is similar to residence time distributions, which you've heard about before. We'll talk a little bit about those in a second. So as CM becomes more integrated in pharmaceutical processes, these sort of models have become more important for the design and operation of our systems. What we're doing here is trying to build a PAT approach to how we use these models. So we make real-time predictions of the concentration. We can make inferences about what the concentration is, and this can give us an idea of the internal state of the system throughout our process line. So this offers challenges offers the ability to understand changes in our system over time, and we can look at how the process varies in real time. For challenging process like encapsulation, this allows us to integrate all that data into one sort of system for understanding what's happening. So first thing, are models really a PAT system? And that's definitely the case. Typically, when we think about PAT, we usually think about process analytical chemistry tools, NIR, Raman. However, there's many other forms of PAT. In the definition, there's several different areas which can be explained as being PAT tools. That includes mathematical tools. So mathematical tools and models are definitely part of the PAT paradigm. And the goal of our modeling program is really to make use of that process data that we're getting from different parts of our system and get a prediction of how the concentration changes with time. So we talked a little bit about residence time distribution. I just want to go over this very quickly. Residence time distribution is a very important concept for continuous manufacturing. It's a result of a simple mass balance calculation. And what we're looking at is the ability to characterize the system in a very particular way. So we're looking at how long it takes material to travel through the continuous system. And basically, not just how long it takes, but the distribution of times. So if I take a certain amount of material and add it to my line, in a system with mixing, you're going to find that some material comes through fast, some material comes through slower, just because it ends up mixing in different places of the line, and it takes a different sort of random walk through the process. By characterizing this, you get a good idea of how much mixing you're happening. More mixing means it takes a broader amount of time, or if you have a broader distribution of times, the material will leave the system. So this is a very important characterization tool of a process. And it's very much tied to the mechanical operation of your process. So this is a very important process, and you can look at this at steady state and have a good idea of how your system's behaving and if things have changed. Where does this come from? So it comes from mass balances. Nice thing about mass is that it's conserved. That means that whatever you put into the system minus whatever comes out of the system is what's accumulating in the system. So it's really just that simple, the basis of these models. If we add in a little bit of assumptions about how material is behaving inside the system, for example, we assume things are well mixed, we end up with a continuously stirred tank reactor model. This is an idealized sort of behavior of a system. It comes from the chemical industry. It's been used for about 100 years now. And it's a great way of looking at a particular type of mixing inside a system. So you ignore a lot of the dynamics. You say, okay, this is an idealized mixing unit in my system. The other basic component of these sort of models is called a plug flow reactor. This comes from the idea that you can have a system like a pipe where material comes in, it stays inside the pipe with no mixing, and then eventually comes out again. So this acts like a delay. So a signal comes into a plug flow reactor, it remains in place, it doesn't change, and then eventually comes out a delayed time later. And it turns out to really understand a entire continuous process, you really need these two assumptions that you can combine together. So let's take an example of that. Let's say I have a particular unit that's more complicated than just mixing perfectly. How do I deal with that? How do I model that? What you do is you take two different CSTR models, you combine them together to get the sort of dynamics you're looking for. For example, in this case, we're looking at an area where, let's say in our continuous line, we have some material that gets stuck in a corner someplace, and it doesn't mix very well, so it comes out slowly. You can model that with two CSTRs that are simply connected together. So you can have the main mixing area where most of the material is, and you can have your area where the mixing is slower, and they talk back and forth to each other. So this can end up changing your residence time distribution to give you a longer curve, a longer tail to your distribution. So by combining these things together, you end up with a more complex looking RTD than you could with just the individual idealized units themselves. And by putting these together, you end up building a very complex set of RTDs about your system. And this is what the chemical industry does for their continuous processes. They'll build these together until they get a good approximation of how their system is working, and they use that to understand the entire continuous process. A great example of this is pharmacokinetics. So this uses the exact same concepts. They use CSTRs to represent different parts of the body and transfers between those different parts of the body that occur. And by using these simple continuous models, you can get a good approximation of what's happening inside the human body over time. So they're very powerful tools. They're used in a lot of different industries, a lot of different scientific applications. And the power really comes from the simplicity, their ability to just be based on this idea of a mass balance model. So how are we using these models? What we're using them for are making real-time predictions. So we're utilizing the real-time data from our feeders. So the feeders are constantly putting material in our system. They're giving us a weight rate that you're running at. So we can see that there. That's the feed rate from one of our feeders. That data is put into our model. It then calculates things in real time and then produces the concentration that's coming out in each of our unit operations over time. So we can see what's happening constantly. The nice thing about these models, or running these models this way, they're not dependent on throughput, so we can have deviations of throughput and still have a good prediction. They're what that means, they're not a representation of residence time. What we're doing here really is combining different data streams, so taking data from our system live and then running it through the models to get a prediction of what's happening and really turning this into a PAT instrument. So a little bit about throughput and RTD. So we said it before that our residence time distribution doesn't actually depend on, or does depend on throughput. You have to have this constant throughput, you have to be at steady state. So this makes sense. A residence time, the amount of time the material spends inside your system, depends on how fast your system is going. If you go slow, you end up with a nice, broad, long distribution. It spends more time inside the line. There's more time for mixing to happen. That means you end up with a broader distribution of times that material can come out. If you go faster, the material will come out quicker. You end up with a shorter, narrower distribution. And this is very important to understand because if you're trying to predict the amount of mixing in your system, you want to have a control over the concentration that comes out the other side. If you start speeding up your line, you'll end up with less and less mixing. So you can end up with a certain point where you're going fast enough that your mixing isn't sufficient to meet your entire line's needs. So this is a way of characterizing your system at a constant throughput, and if you want to change that throughput, you need to actually characterize your system again to make sure you have an understanding of how that changes with throughput. And this can be, obviously you run most processes at a constant throughput set point. There can be deviations, so it's important to be able to handle those. But also, if you're working at a multi-strength product, where you're making multiple strengths on the same line for the same product, you're probably going to be running at different throughputs for each of those products. And that means that you're going to have a set of RTDs available for understanding your process and controlling them. So having an approach that's independent of throughput for predictions is an important advantage. So here's an example of the constant calculation process. We're seeing a constant throughput. We see a change in the API mass rate, and we're seeing the response of the system. So this is the sort of thing we'd see from our actual system here. The changes happening with time. We're getting second-by-second updates on what the concentration is based on what our feeders are doing. Here's another example where we change throughput. So the feeder goes through the same step. Our concentration starts to change. The throughput of the entire line, so basically all the feeders summed together have slowed down. And that means we have a change in our response. And you can see, compared from one to the next, the difference in the amount of time it takes for that concentration to change. And that's very important for understanding if this sort of thing would occur during a process, you would have to change how you're controlling. But our system's able to take that into account automatically. So what's really the utility of these sort of real-time process models? It gives us a PAT kind of understanding of what's happening. We're utilizing our feeder data to really understand our process and to predict what's happening. We can have an understanding of the long-term health of the system by monitoring these models over time. We can see if there's any changes to the structure of our models or structures of our system. That indicates something's changing and something we want to address. We have a constant evaluation of the product quality, which is what we're really excited about. Now, this makes, for diversion more efficient, if let's say there was a disturbance to the process that we want to remove material from the system, we're able to predict the concentration and determine what material needs to be removed and what material can stay very accurately. The other thing we can do here that we can't do with spectroscopic methods typically is we can divert based on all of the feeder data. So in other words, each of the materials we're looking at here, our magnesium stearate, our disintegrant, the API, other materials that may be inside the formulation, we're monitoring each of the feeders and we're making predictions of each of the feeders' concentrations or what the concentration of that material is. If any of them go outside a particular bound, we can reject that material. So typically when you're looking at this from a PAT perspective, you're looking at spectroscopic methods, you're really only analyzing your data from your API. Other critical parts of your system, other critical parts of your formulation may not have the same level of visibility of what's going on. Here's an example of rejection. So we're seeing our feeder data and our model prediction are in agreement. They're right on top of each other. Suddenly we have an issue with a feeder. It's deposited too much material. Our concentration starts to rise. It goes outside some bounds. Rejection starts. It comes back within the bounds. We can wait a slight delay and then start accepting the material again. So over time, we're watching how the concentration changes, and our system's constantly evaluating this relative to our limits and can reject material dynamically if necessary. All right, so how do we build these real-time process models? And there's important thoughts to go into how you want to build these. Really want to focus on how the model structure and parameters are determined. So our goal is really to build an accurate model that represents the physical structure of our lithium line. That's not always necessary. Sometimes you can simplify There's certain parts of the system that are relatively small, like the mill, that doesn't necessarily have a big impact on the overall performance of the system. However, for us and to help us with our flexibility, we really want all of those different unit operations to be evaluated as part of the model. This really helps us enable our modular approach. So we want the mass input from each feeder. That's a major input for our process model. And step one really is assess each piece of equipment, try to determine what kind of structural model should be in there, and start evaluating the system. So if we look at the different systems here, our blender and our co-mill are both represented well by CSTRs, so single CSTRs is all we need. For our encapsulator, with all the different parts in there, it's much more complex. We need a more complex model to really get the same dynamics. And one thing we started looking at as we evaluated this, we looked at it and said, okay, you have this very large common hopper. It's possible for material to get stuck in there. The exits are really near the edges of the hopper, so material in the sides may not actually get out. So we started looking at whether or not there's a slow mixing zone or a dead zone inside that feeder. And when we did collected our data on our system and analyzed it, we found that yes, the best models for predicting this really said there was a dead zone inside the large common hopper where material was not actually getting out and into the rest of the process. That can be a risk to run with because you have material that's in there for an unknown amount of time. You really want your mixing to be complete. So we've looked at solving this now with different changes to how the system runs and are pretty confident we can remediate that. From there, we refine our model parameters. We get a better prediction over time, and we make sure we can get a good idea of what's happening inside our system. I think I'm losing the microphone again. Sorry, everyone. Okay. How's that? Can everyone hear me? All right. Try number 2. Okay, where are we? Oh, so we're looking at how we solve these sort of things. So there's a lot of different considerations taking place when you start actually solving these the systems in your control system. So one thing that's very important is that because to get a live prediction, you need to solve ordinary differential equations in real time. There's lots of different ways to do this, but one important factor is that you have to have your control system talk to that prediction. The prediction has to come in the control system so that it can see it and make decisions on whether or not to divert the material. That can have challenges in itself. How does it talk to the system? Can we integrate it into the control system directly? A lot of different decisions need to go into that. What we really want to do here for us was to make sure that we're modeling our physical systems with our models. And this is really important for our modularity. We want to be able to take systems out, let's say remove a mill for a different product. We want our control system to have the modularity to say, okay, that mill's not there anymore, but all our models still work. We don't have to rebuild them for each product we come in. And that has certain complexities with it as well. So what we want to do is program in certain model blocks. So in other words, different combinations of CSTRs and feeders, or sorry, CSTRs and plug flow reactors that we can get an accurate prediction for different kind of dynamics and different kind of systems. So we can go through a recipe for each of our products and pick out what models we want for each of our unit operations, put them into place, determine the parameters for them, and we can do that for each of the pieces of equipment very flexibly as we change our system for different products. So I want to show a little bit of calibration data here, and talk about some of the interesting aspects of using these sort of models. So what you're seeing here is step changes in API concentration from 40% to 10%. This was micronized APAP, which is a very poorly flowing material, and changing 40% to 10% is a really big change in material properties. However, even though we're making those big changes in concentration, we're able to calibrate our model just fine. And this gives us quite a bit of confidence that we're really looking at changes in the physical holdup of the system. It's not so much dependent on powder properties, just the amount of material that's in the system, as theory would predict. We used NR spectroscopic probes to determine the concentration. We did this in a particular way. We didn't look at building a model. We can actually use normalized PCA scores directly to make this sort of prediction. Process models are very sensitive to the timing of events. So if you look at this and say, okay, what's the timing at which different transitions come through, that's really the most important thing for modeling the system. So we can calibrate our data based just on these dynamics. Another really important part to look at here is the process stops. So you'll see little gaps in the NIR data as this goes through. And what's happening there is our encapsulator is stopping. It's running into a problem with capsule shells handling, has to stop. Someone has to go clean out part of the capsule shells. And that is very important for us because that's A, how the machine is really going to operate. And that means our calibration data set takes that into account. We want to be able to say we're predicting what's happening in a real system in real time. The other nice thing is the model is able to handle that just fine. So the process stops and restarts. We don't really have an issue with how the model behaves. It's very important for us to be able to get that similar behavior when we're actually running. So performance, how are the models operating? So the model represents the concentration well. We have an RMSE of 1.5% of target, so that's a kind of metric for how well the model is predicting the system. So we can get our target concentration predicted to within 1.5%. That compares well with our deviation limits. You can have deviation limits of, let's say, 5%. As long as we're being larger than that, we can actually predict our concentration and then divert the material if necessary. Our model is also very stable. So we have data sets going back to 2017 to 2019. And over that course of time, our process models parameters haven't changed. So our system doesn't change over time. That's very important to understand how your process model is robust to time changes. And this fits well with our understanding as well about being really about the amount of mass inside the system and tied to that physical nature. So as long as the physical nature of your machine doesn't change, your model parameters should also remain pretty stable. So what we want to do next is really look at improving, or talk about improving the startup and shutdown process and dealing with frequent stops of the machine. A lot of the models we've been looking at so far have really been based on a steady state assumption. So we're looking at things that aren't changing with time. It does an adequate job, but for startup, which can be very long for a process of this size, as well as some of these stops and starts, we really want something that's a little more dynamic, takes into account those facts that we're not necessarily always at steady state. So we use here dynamic mass balance models. We're removing the steady state assumption. For CSDR model blocks, the complexity is not that much larger. So we have a small increase in complexity. The equations are a little bit more complex. We're still solving ordinary differential equations, but overall the jump in complexity is not that hard. We can handle that pretty easily. Plug flow reactors, a little more complex. We'll talk about those in a second. What we're really doing here is allowing yourselves a wider range of control. For a steady state assumption, you need this amount of mass of the system to stay very constant, even as small throughput changes can happen. That means we need to have a small operating range of the amount of material in our common hopper. So we can imagine running a large encapsulator with a lot of material inside a hopper. Material is constantly coming in from our feeders and filling that line, and as long as the encapsulator is on and running, material is leaving that common hopper at the same rate it's coming in, so the level stays nice and constant. The moment something happens in the encapsulator forces it to slow down or stop, the amount of material in that hopper jumps up, and we have to have limits on how far that can move in order to make sure we're maintaining our accuracy of our models. And that means we have a relatively tight range at which we can operate in there, and if you're running very stably for many hours, that's not really a big deal. It's a nice way to run. If you have an encapsulator that has more process stops and starts that can happen unexpectedly, that makes that more difficult to run overall. So we get ourselves a much wider level of control by using these sort of models. The other thing that's a little more complex is you need some kind of measurement of the exit rate. So in order to complete the mass balance, you need another source of data. That's fairly easy to come by in these sort of data-rich environments. You can get your rate at which your encapsulator is running. You can have level measurements that can go into it. You can use a bunch of different measurements to really complete that equation. Let's talk about non-steady plug flow reactors. They're more challenging than CSDRs. The basic problem here is that you end up with a more complex partial differential equation rather than an ordinary differential equation. For a steady state, the solution here is trivial. You end up simply with a delay. So material enters a plug flow reactor, it waits in there with no real mixing, it doesn't change at all, and then eventually comes out the other side after a certain amount of time. So that's all that's happening at steady state. In a dynamic environment, the amount of material inside the plug flow reactor may change, the rate at which it's going may change, so material may come in at a different rate that it's leaving. You end up with a more complex set of dynamics inside the plug flow reactor that you have to take into account now. That really means you have to track the material as it moves through it in an accurate way. This is not especially difficult. Any kind of laptop computer can handle this easily, but it becomes more of a factor when you're thinking about this from a control point of view. You need to complete your solution to your models in the amount of time frame for your control system. So if your control system operates on a second-by-second basis, you need to start your calculation, complete the calculation, and return the data to the control system all within that 1 second. Definitely doable, but something to think about when you talk about the complexity of these sort of models. Make sure you're getting the right accuracy of your model and the right rate at which it's producing results. I think I have a few more minutes. I just want to talk a little bit about model recovery. This is a really interesting aspect of these sort of models. Typically, when we think about the models, we kind of worry about whether or not bad data it can change the model prediction over time. So in other words, does errors compound to get a more and more inaccurate prediction? And that's true for several models. You can think about trying to measure your distance someplace by measuring how fast you're going, the direction you're going. Any kind of small error tends to compound over time. That is not the case with these sort of models. The nice thing about these models is they're constantly getting data from the feeders. So they're constantly getting new data in, and that can replace old data that's come in. So they tend to recover. So this is very similar to what's happening physically inside the system. As inaccurate data comes in, it packs the calculations predictions, but that old data is constantly being pushed through the system and out the other side. So you end up with this sort of change in the system prediction and then a recovery to the normal. So you have small errors that occur. Those don't really matter because they'll end up being washed out over time. So as long as your average data coming in is accurate, your models will return to their accurate prediction. And you can respond to these inaccuracies in a conservative manner. All right, I'd like to conclude. We're using a modular approach for continuous manufacturing at Thermo Fisher. We're building a continuous encapsulation line for a customer. We think this is a high capability pathway for continuous manufacturing. We're looking at filing next year. We're very excited about that. We're building process models for real-time prediction using a PAT sort of method. We think this is a very efficient way of running a large machine like an encapsulator. This is not dependent on constant throughput, so we can have more accuracy over time and a better prediction of what's going on. And we are looking at, or we're using dynamic non-steady models for understanding how something like an encapsulator, which has a more dynamic behavior, works and predicts how our system works. And it makes our startup and shutdown more efficient. All right, I'd like to acknowledge a large number of people, the entire CM team at Thermo Fisher. We have a great team of people. We're working together to build this sort of system. It's been a pleasure to work with them. I've been there for about 1.5 years now, and it's been a great experience. I'd like to say to the audience that we're a CDMO, so we're very open about talking to people about what we work on and how we do things. We have people come by all the time who are interested. We give them tours of our system. We talk to them about what we're going on. So if you're interested in hearing more, please contact me. Stop me. I have cards, but also my email is up here. And stop on by. We'll show you how our continuous line works, and we'll talk to you a lot about your needs and how we can potentially fill them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kernan. Excellent presentation. So we have about 10-15 minutes for questions. Yes, Lawrence.
Hi, Kiernan. Nice presentation. Thank you very much. I was wondering, in the graph that you showed, there was no drawing of a reject port after the blender, and you talk about such a big holdup and that making the system slow. So why would you choose not to put a reject port there?
So we really believe in rejecting at the point that you're most interested in. So we're concentration at our capsules are our place where we're really interested in maintaining the accuracy of the model. We have such a large amount of material in the encapsulator, it actually does an enormous amount of mixing in there. So more mixing happens there than anywhere else in the line because it has the most material than anywhere else in the line. So a disturbance that comes through the blender may or may not be really an issue. When it comes into the encapsulator, that's really where most of the mixing will play. So small deviations will all get blended together inside the encapsulator. On top of that, when you reject from a blender, you can always disrupt what's happening. We have as much fun with maintaining the encapsulator at a steady state. By changing the amount of material coming in and out to the encapsulator, that's going to be an extra set of deviations from how the steady state's operating inside the encapsulator. So we believe in trying to get that one point of rejection where the product's being made.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Thanks for nice presentation. So what one should be in consideration while doing such model validation? It's critical things and most important things.
Well, I think there's several critical things to think about. One, you really want to work through all of the different sort of design considerations you have for your models. If you're thinking that you may go through throughput changes, you want to model those in part of your validation. You want to produce data that is as close to how you would actually operate. So if you process will stop and start, you want to make sure that's in there as well. And really show that you're able to control through your actual operations. As long as you have all those factors in there, you should have a really good validation.
Okay. Other questions? Comments? Yes. Go ahead.
I wonder, what's the acceptance from health authorities for the model-based running of the plant? Because I think I can see it from big agencies, but from the smaller ones, there could be some challenges.
Possibly. We've talked to our regulator frequently, which is important. We've gone to the ETD, met with the client, and with them on many occasions. We showed them the data. We showed them how we're playing our process modeling. Several of these slides actually came from talks that we originally gave to them. So we want to make sure we're communicating to them about how we're planning to do this, how the models really work, how we're validating their behavior, and proving that they have the capability to do what we think they're doing. And we think we've got great feedback from them, and we know what their concerns are and how we can address them. Right now, we're really focused on getting this up and running for our United States market. And then I think as this comes, it'll be like NIR probes or other kinds of PAT methods that are been accepted now by more and more of the world. I think this sort of thing, once it's demonstrated to be really effective, we'll definitely get there.
Okay. Other questions or comments? Once more? Okay. Thank you very much, Karim, for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
So the next presentation by Giustino from J&J, and he's going to walk us through making a conversion from batch to continuous. Giustino.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I would like to thank, first of all, Ima for the invitation and for the opportunity to present our journey and experience in continuous manufacturing at Janssen. It's a great pleasure being here today, and it's always a pleasure to talk about continuous manufacturing, a technology which I truly believe is changing the future of pharmaceutical manufacturing. So what I would like to do is to guide you through our experience, our strategy and vision in continuous manufacturing in the next years to come, but also guide you through some of our not only experience, but also some of the key aspects of continuous manufacturing for all of solid dosage forms, and see how continuous manufacturing is not only changing the commercial operations, but changing and revolutionizing, at some extent, the strategies we do drug product development in new products, so at early stages of R&D. So what about our strategy and journey? Well, we started our journey back in 2008 when, in collaboration with the CSOPs, a group of universities which probably you have already heard of, we decided to conceptualize the idea of continuous manufacturing for oral drug products with a real industrial application. So we identified Presista, a medicine for HIV and already on the market as a batch process, as an ideal candidate due to the relatively low complexity of the formulation and also the fairly high volume at the time. So between 2010 and 2013, in collaboration with Rutgers University, we designed, implemented, and qualified our first self-assembled direct compression line for continuous. At the same time, we started development for Presista, starting at Rutgers University, and once the line was available in our supply chain facility, then we transferred. Until 2015, when we filed the process. And it was an expedited approval. In fact, we filed in December 2015, and we got approval in April 2016. And this was a major milestone in the field of continuous manufacturing. In fact, it was the first time that FDA had ever approved a switch from batch to continuous manufacturing. And from here, things went really fast. In fact, in less than 3 years, we got approval for Presista, 600 milligrams, in 13 additional countries. We got approval by PMDA for our second legacy product that we converted from batch to continuous manufacturing, Tramacet, a combination of tramadol and paracetamol, which is being manufactured in our supply chain site in Latina, Italy. We also invested in our first R&D continuous manufacturing line as a part of a much bigger strategy, but I will get back to that in a couple of slides. But first of all, why the journey? Why did we invest so much time, resources, and effort in continuous manufacturing? Well, the answer is easy. At Janssen, we strongly believe that continuous manufacturing has the potential of increasing flexibility, agility, and quality of pharmaceutical manufacturing. And we also believe that continuous manufacturing has the potential of modernizing, even though we are not quite there yet, as Professor Trout told about it yesterday, but has the potential of modernizing pharmaceutical manufacturing, which, especially if we look at the oral drug product, is somehow stuck to the 50s. Now, I don't want to go through all the different advantages of continuous manufacturing, which were brilliantly discussed yesterday by Moheb and other speakers, but I want to stress the fact, one of the biggest advantages of continuous manufacturing, at least I found personally highly fascinating, is quality. In fact, thanks to advanced control strategies, continuous manufacturing enables not only a much higher level of control, but also process understanding of what's going on in your process, which you will never reach with your conventional batch processes. And this is the reason why FDA and other regulatory agencies, they are strongly advocating a switch from batch to continuous manufacturing. Being continuous also, as has been said yesterday, a true enabler for quality by design. Now, was the journey easy? Well, definitely was not, and especially for us because we were one of the first players implementing continuous manufacturing. So we had to deal with a lot of new aspects, from process design, control strategies, using RTD and PAT and real-time process models to ensure material traceability in a dynamic process and also divert real-time non-conforming material. We had to deal with automation and more recently with real-time release testing. But the key question here is not whether the journey was easy, rather if the journey was rewarding. And the answer is absolutely yes. And the data for Persista, they speak by themselves. So thanks to continuous manufacturing, we were able to reduce the manufacturing cycling time for Persista from 13 days to less than 25 hours, which also meant a reduction of around 70% in man-hour. We reduced the footprint of more than 50%, and the data, which I found personally highly fascinating, is the reduction in release testing cycling time from, we've seen here, more than 21 days in batch to less than 1 day in continuous manufacturing, thanks to real-time release testing. I will get back to that later. So after the, I would say, success of Persista, where are we now? What is the strategy and vision in the next years for us at Janssen? As Lawrence mentioned yesterday, we currently have 2 continuous manufacturing lines in our commercial supply chains, one in Gurabo in Puerto Rico, one in Latina, Italy, where Persista and Tramoset are manufactured respectively. And these lines are also dedicated whenever there will be the occasion to do that, to convert potentially other legacy products. We also have invested recently in a first R&D continuous manufacturing line as part of a bigger strategy. What does it mean? It means that a few years ago, Janssen made the commitment of using continuous manufacturing as the standard platform for developing new chemical entities. So that means that the entire oral solid portfolio of Johnson & Johnson Pharma, with, of course, few exceptions where it doesn't make sense to go in continuous, but they will go in continuous manufacturing. And to enable this strategy, we also have invested in a new commercial line, which is now being installed in our supply chain in Latina, Italy, which shares the same PAT strategy, automation as the line we have in development. And the reason for this, what we addressed internally as a mirror strategy, so really one-to-one transfer, is to enable one of the key advantages of continuous manufacturing, which is the speed to market. So really have a seamless tech transfer, reducing the time needed for transfer, reducing API needs and efforts. And also to reduce the risk associated to tech transfer. If we look at where most of the things go wrong during our development activities is during tech transfer, when we have to scale up or scale out to different equipment or equipment sizes. Continuous manufacturing offers an opportunity, definitely, to de-risk that aspect. I want to comment a bit more on this tech transfer strategy. So definitely using continuous manufacturing, we are, let's say, not using a conventional tech transfer anymore. It's definitely more a lean approach. But we are still repeating some activities. For instance, a confirmation run to make sure that everything in commercial runs out smoothly. But we're being challenging ourselves and saying, okay, if everything, if we can guarantee during development that the process is very robust and we are transferring to an exact copy of the line, do we really need to do a conventional tech transfer, or even there is any need of repeating any development activities? Or can a virtual tech transfer where we simply transfer process parameters can become a new normal? And we really hope that in the near future, we will be implementing this new strategy. Speaking of vision, a bit with a longer term, I would say at least 10 years, and trying to make Lauren's dream come true, we are definitely working on the concept of modularity and flexibility. So Lawrence already presented brilliantly yesterday what is the idea of Janssen behind this concept, but I just want to restate the fact that we are dealing a lot with a very dynamic product portfolio and very dynamic market demands. So we do need lines which are flexible and modular. So not only in terms of throughput, but also in terms of equipment which the lines are capable of. I'd like to guide you through now some of the key aspects of continuous manufacturing for oral solid dosage forms. And I tried to put in this slide some of the key aspects or hot topics that we've been dealing through kind of chronologically from the beginning till now in continuous manufacturing, going from material characterization, use of real-time process models, some regulatory aspects, for instance, batch definition, but also more, let's say, contemporary aspects like validation approaches using continuous manufacturing, and then again, real-time release testing, etc. Most of the things that have been discussed already yesterday, but I think this is the disadvantage of being a speaker in a second day where everything has been discussed and answered the first day. But I will try and go through some of the things giving a different aspects, at least giving an industrial perspective to it. We don't have the time to go through every aspect, but if you see anything in this slide that you find particularly interesting or you would like to discuss more into details, feel free to reach out to myself or Lawrence. We'll be happy to engage in a discussion in the next days. There are a few things I would like to discuss a bit more into details. One of them is material characterization. So we hear a lot about process dynamics, control strategies, but we don't talk, I think, enough about material characterization, material properties, and the impact that material properties can have in continuous manufacturing. Why I'm saying this is because if I look at my product portfolio in small molecules, the majority is class 2 or class 4 BCS compounds. So they're poorly soluble compounds. They don't need micronization, some sort of particle engineering, or enabling technology, like spray drying, hot melt extrusion, etc. So the powder I have to deal with is very cohesive, very static, very difficult to process. Well, you might say this is not a big difference compared to batch. True, but in batch, you're dealing with a final blend, which has a decent flowability. If it doesn't flow, then you don't have a process. In continuous manufacturing, your API, which is not your best friend here, has to be fed through your gravimetric feeders. And what happens in 80% of our cases, at least with our APIs, is what you see in the picture here. So it's so static that it doesn't get even through the screws of our gravimetric feeders. So certain aspects like triple electric charging, which of course were important in batch, in continuous manufacturing they become even more important because this aspect can have an impact overall on the process dynamics. Very important then is also to understand batch-to-batch variability and how this can affect your process, both for the API and the excipients. Now, in the interest of time, I'll only mention one example with the API. And what you see in here on the left side is a fit factor profile, so amount of material dispensed per screw revolution in a gravimetric feeder for 3 different batches of the same API. In red is the first material we processed on the line. In the meantime, then our colleagues from chemistry, they upscale the crystallization process and they deliver the batch in green, which according to them had the same particle size distribution, same shape, same everything. At the same time, we were also trying to make the API flow better. So we removed the fine, we optimized the aspect ratio, and we produced this batch in blue. But let's park it for a while because it's intentionally different. The red and green, they're supposed to be identical. And to be fair, in a batch process, they were identical because we're doing a co-development of batch and continuous at the time. We did not see any difference between the 2 batches in a batch process. But in continuous manufacturing, I hope that the video works okay, you can see that the batch in green actually had a better flowability compared to the one in red, even though they were identical, according to colleagues from chemistry. Even more shocking from a scientific point of view was that the batch in blue, which using common knowledge would have been the one flowing better, was actually the worst material we ever processed on the line. It had even worse flowability than some needle-like crystals we put in the gravimetric feeders. And this opened my eyes and made me realize how complex flow behavior really is. Now, I'm not an engineer, so I mean, I can afford saying that I have underestimated certain things. But definitely there is much more than size, shape, or density in characterizing the flow of your material. There is a lot of properties like nano roughness, rugosity, surface polarity, and you name it, that can have a strong impact on flow of material. So our strategy, and that's the big difference compared to what we've been working in a batch world, we do a lot of more material characterization and understanding of material properties and potential impact on the process dynamics. So together with colleagues from chemistry, we try to build as much as variability as possible at early stages, trying to see what is the impact, for instance, on the feeding performance. Another important aspect of continuous manufacturing is the process understanding. And by this, I mean process dynamics, traceability, transient operation. I'm sorry to disappoint Mohab, but the talk today is a bit different than what I gave last time, so I won't be focusing a lot on RTD and process dynamics, but I do have a couple of slides to talk about this. So what you see here, it's a schematic of a simple direct compression line with the gravimetric feeders, blenders, and the tablet press. Now, your gravimetric feeders, they are the key, the core of a continuous process, and they are a great element of control. Actually, you could control the process just using the feeder parametrics, but they are not perfect. So there is a lot of variation, which is due to, of course, material characteristics, but also refill or vibrations of the line, etc. So what can happen is that you might have a disturbance during the process. And what you see there in green is actually a screenshot of one of our manufacturing run in Presista, where you can have, quite a strong disturbance during the process. What does it mean? Well, in theory, you would need to assume that this disturbance will propagate through the line, through your blenders, your tablet press, and you will find it in the tablets. In reality, we know that this will never happen because there is always a certain degree of mixing in the line. Of course, mixing in the blenders, but also in the feed frame of the tablet press. So the key question you have to ask yourself is, what is the impact of that disturbance in the final tablets and the quality of the tablets? Because at the end, what really matters is quality of your final drug product. And another important question is, in case you know that there is an impact of that disturbance in the tablets, how can I make sure to deviate surgically only the portion of the run which is affected by the disturbance, so that I don't have to stop the line and throw away everything? Otherwise, continuous manufacturing doesn't become that interesting compared to batch anymore, if I have to every time throw everything, right? And a key aspect in this is given by resident time distribution. It's one of the key element of controls that we've been using for Presista, Thermoset, but also for all the new products as sort of a platform for our control strategies, also in combination potentially with PAT. I won't go through, well, in a simplistic way, RTD, even though it's been already explained brilliantly by Kernan before, is a probability distribution function. So basically, describes the amount of time that the material spends into a unit operation or in your entire line. I won't go through much into details and technical aspects, because Kernan explained very, very nicely how do we do things and how do we use CSTR or PFR modeling to do RTD. But what we do, basically, very high level, we determine RTD in the different unit operations, so your feeders, for instance, your blenders, your tablet press, and then by convolution and, of course, confirming the data, we have a full real-time RTD. And this is a very powerful tool because it can be used for a variety of things, to set alarms in your feeders, to understand process dynamics. And one of the nicest and more kind of fascinating application is real-time diversion of non-conforming material. So basically, your RTD model can translate the feeder data into concentration of API in the tablets. What does it mean? So if you do have a deviation during your feeder performance, so of a certain intensity of duration, your RTD model translates that disturbance into concentration of API in the tablets. And in case you are out of spec, and out of spec can be your USP nano 5 value, then the system can trigger automatically a diversion of those tablets. And as soon as, based on your RTD model, the disturbance is kind of smeared out, then the tablets are being collected again. Now, again, I don't want to bother you with the technicalities, but the way we do RTD is a mix of experimental, modeling, and analytical, right? And there is always a certain error associated to each of the steps. And we take into account this propagation of errors, and we subtract it from the out-of-spec limit. So basically, we have a lower limit for rejection, and in a simplistic way, we start the diversion earlier, we end it later, to make sure that we have up to a 6 sigma level of confidence that the tablets we are collecting are good tablets. Why I'm saying all of this is because I always get upset when people believe and they say that continuous manufacturing is only a strategy to cut down costs or to reduce manufacturing cycle time. It's actually even more to increase quality of your product. And it's not that we deliver bad quality with batch process, but with continuous manufacturing, we can even increase quality of the medicines we deliver to our patients. A few other things on continuous I'd like to go through, and again, Moheb talked about it yesterday, so batch definition, bioequivalence, interaction with regulatory agencies. But I will share my experience, our experience from an industrial perspective. Starting from batch definition, again, Moheb described it brilliantly. The definition that you know from batch word can be applied to continuous manufacturing. The difference between batch and continuous is that in batch, if you want to produce more material, you need a bigger equipment size. In continuous manufacturing, you simply have to run the equipment for longer. But the batch size can be defined as a function of your runtime and throughput rate. And this is, for instance, what we do for Presista. So for Presista, we run at 40 kgs an hour. We have validated up to 32 hours. So the batch size is defined as a function of these two parameters. Or can be defined as a volume of material being produced, or again, as a feed amount that the raw material that you feed into the system. And this is what we do, for instance, for Thermoset, where we worked, as yesterday Lawrence mentioned, with a pre-blend of material onto our thin screw granulator. But again, I want to confirm what Moheb said yesterday. Even though the batch size definition is flexible, you have to define a priori your batch size definition as a link to the control strategy. Other thing by equivalence, when I go to conferences, there is always someone who asks, so what is the chance that I'm asked to do a bioequivalence study in case I switch my product from batch to continuous manufacturing? This is my opinion, doesn't necessarily reflect that of Janssen, but I don't see any difference whatsoever between batch and continuous manufacturing. If you do have a class 2 or class 4 BCS compounds and you do change the composition of the process considerably, you might be asked, or there is a high chance that you will be asked to run a bioequivalence study. Our experience with Presista is a bit different. Darunavir, the active ingredient of Presista, is a class 2 BCS. We did change the formulation slightly. We removed one of the excipients. And as a process, well, it's direct compression, but we, of course, replace manual feeding and diffusive blending with gravimetric feeding and convective blending. But we managed to get a biowaiver. But again, as Moab said yesterday, it's all the ammunition and the strong rationale you have to convince the regulatory agencies that your strategy is solid enough. But that doesn't mean that you always get a biowaiver or you always be asked to do a bioequivalence study. It's really case by case. But our strategy in general for new products is to implement continuous manufacturing and lock the formulation prior to any pivotal clinical study in order to avoid to being asked bioequivalence afterwards. Other key aspects of continuous is real-time release testing, which as defined by the ICHQ8 is the way to ensure quality of the final drug product based on in-process data. And what better process if not continuous manufacturing to enable real-time release testing? But I think there is no doubt that continuous manufacturing offers you a great opportunity to do RT-RT. The question that several people have is, does it make sense or is it an overkill? Once again, we can only speak by experience and data. One of my favorite quotations is always, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And what you see in here is what it meant for us applying RT-RT for Presista. So when we launched Presista in batch process in 2008, of course, everything went through the QC lab. And to do the testing or to release the batch, it took more than 21 days. When we launched Precista as a batch process in 2016, ID, content uniformity, and assay were done as a RT-RT using PAT data, but purity and dissolution were done in the lab. But we already cut from 21 days to 8 days. This year, FDA approved our surrogate model to predict dissolution of the runavir based on inline data, and we got sunset for purity. And as you can see, we went from 21 to 8 to less than 1 day to release the batch, and this is pretty impressive. So is there an advantage of real-time release testing? I would say yes. Is it easy? No. And definitely for new products we have in the pipeline, which are more complex than Precista, to develop surrogate models will be even more complicated. But we are strongly believers that RT-RT is one of the key elements of continuous manufacturing. So as early as in development, we start collecting data to support the development of RT-RT by the time we get in commercial. Another key aspect, interaction with regulatory agencies, and was described, again, talked about it yesterday. What you see in the slide here is all the approvals we have for Precista globally. Actually, there is Algeria missing. Now, coming back to one of the comments from someone yesterday, said, yeah, I know about FDA, EMA, but what about the other regulatory agencies? Well, you don't see only FDA and EMA here. You see Ukraine, you see Taiwan, you see Brazil. So definitely, I mean, we can say that it's possible. We have proven that it's possible. And our experience dealing with regulatory agencies, it's been extremely positive. It's true that FDA has a much stronger technical understanding of continuous manufacturing than others, but all the regulatory agencies we have interacted with, they do realize the advantage of continuous manufacturing for patients, and they've been extremely supportive of implementing this technology. Again, I wanted to confirm what Mohab said yesterday, reach out proactively to the health authorities. Don't go there with open questions, but go there with a strategy. But there is definitely a willing to help you out from all of them. And I mean, the situation has been reflected to what we see today on the market. So again, I don't want to repeat what has been said yesterday, but we have 5 approvals from the FDA, the same in Europe. We have recently a new approval from PMDA, from our Thermoset. We have more than 30 accepted requests in the emergency technology program, and we have a lot of new chemical entities being developed using continuous manufacturing. So we might see in the next 5 to 10 years an exponential increase of product filed using this technology. I still have a few minutes left, so I wanted to go through also how continuous manufacturing is impacting research and development, right? Because we've been talking a lot about conversion of legacy products, but the strategy is definitely to work on new chemical entities. Now, the biggest impact that continuous manufacturing is having on R&D is the implementation of a final size equipment much earlier in development. So we don't work with, progressive size equipment, but we implement kind of the final equipment much earlier. Sometimes we even use continuous to make phase 1 clinical batches or phase 2. Now, of course, this has a strong advantage when it comes to de-risking, things that might go wrong later on. But one of the disadvantage, or partial disadvantage, is API consumption at early stages, which is a bit higher than what we do need in batch. Overall, continuous manufacturing still beats batch in terms of API saving, especially if you look at the tech transfer phase. If you're transferring to a similar equipment, we might save several hundred kgs of material compared to batch. And at this stage, API still is quite costly, so it's a major saving that we do. But we cannot neglect the fact that at early stages of development, we might need more material, also because we have our RTD model, PAT models, etc. to develop. And we cannot neglect the fact that at this stage, API is very costly, is very scarce, and the therapeutic areas, most of the time, they are not willing to front load and invest the production of a huge amount of API when the chances of this program even to get through are very thin. So we want to make this stage even more interesting than what it is today, right? And we've been working with universities like Rutgers and Ghent University in Europe to develop strategies to accelerate development, but also to save materials. And one of the greatest collaboration we have been having is this creation of material property database, a real library of material excipients and APIs, not only internal but also external, that in combination with multivariate data analysis can offer a really holistic and powerful tool to backtrack the effect of material on the line, to find surrogate materials that we can use as a replacement for our API to the development, or even data predictive models to basically link the material properties to the unit operations. One example of application is the working with surrogate materials. So our aspiration in the next few years is to being able to identify a surrogate material, meaning a material which is inexpensive, non-toxic, and available on the market off the shelf within Janssen, that we can use as a replacement for our API. So has similar characteristics to the API. So we can do development with this material and then confirm with our API, right? So what we do basically is once we have a new material, we characterize a certain data package, we project into PCA, and we looked in the space how this material fits with the other materials we have in the library. And then, based on this, we can basically, as I mentioned earlier, run development with the surrogate and then confirm with the final API. Another application then is creation of this data-driven models. Again, starting from material property database, we've been creating models for the different unit operations. For instance, for the feeders when it comes to feed factor, resident time distribution, etc. And even for the blenders, the tablet press, and the different unit ops. So basically what we can do is predict in silico, for instance, what kind of screw configuration we want to use for the new product, even without running the experiments. What we can do then here, again, starting with a new material, we characterize the material, we project into a PLS model, we can select the screw configuration based on the predicted feed factor, then we run a confirmatory trial with our API, and we update the model knowledge based on the new data. So we are working on it, and this is really definitely changing the way we do development using continuous manufacturing. We are today at a stage where we are implementing models for single unit operation, and then next, hopefully within 5 years, we'll be able to do a flow sheet modeling. So really a digital twin of our line, digital copy of our hardware line, where we can run in silico experiments and predict sort of the impact of material properties or process parameters on the final quality attributes. We're also working on interchangeability models. I mean, we see more and more equipment vendors going into continuous manufacturing, and we cannot exclude the possibility of transferring the product from a line to different line. And this might be a challenge, of course. So we want to reduce the development effort in transferring from line to different line. And also, we're trying to reduce the development effort in case we want to increase or reduce the throughput later on in commercial. And again, at the same time, we're working a lot with in vitro and in vivo models, not only in support of RT-RT, but in general as our biopharm overall strategy. So, sorry, I gave you a lot of information today, but the key message is that continuous manufacturing is much more than an equipment. There is a strong synergism between different disciplines, between formulation, material characterization, modeling, regulatory, quality, you name it. It is a big investment, not really in terms of equipment, but more in terms of competences you have to build in the company. So you have to bring in, attract talent, you have to develop people you have internally. But this investment will definitely pay off in terms of financial, operational advantages, and first and foremost, quality. With that, that's all. I will try and answer the questions. In case I'm not able, I will note them down and report them back to our experts.
Thank you very much, Giustino. Excellent presentation. So I have a question for you. I noticed in your presentation that from the regulatory perspective, you got approval for the change in process from batch to continuous, and then later on, you got another approval for real-time release testing?
Yes.
Okay. So why did you do that? Is it to minimize the risk?
At the second stage, you mean?
Right. Why did you do it in 2 steps rather than in a single step?
Well, the full story is that we actually did submit 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, our surrogate model to predict the solution for persistent was rejected because we wanted to, FDA asked us to come back and create more data, generate more data. So it's been a two-tier approach, mainly because of this aspect. But also wasn't the intention in the beginning to file RT together with the process. It's never been the scope, but it's something we wanted to do at some point.
Okay, so if you do it again, are you going to use the same approach, or are you going to do it in one shot?
Not necessarily. We're trying to do it in one shot. Okay. Again, not always probably it makes sense, so it's always, a business case evaluation. It depends, but if we do it again, then most likely we'll do it in one shot.
Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Yeah. So, good morning. It's a very interesting presentation. I have one question. When we are changing the interchangeability model, okay, what are all the due diligence one has to do that, and what is the regulatory guidance for the same?
For the interchangeability models, well, we are at the very early stage of it. We just realized that there is a need for interchangeability models because we might need to transfer to different lines. And what we see in batch, when transferring to different equipment, things might go wrong, right? Or there is a certain redevelopment effort that you have to put into it. And I just think that one of the key advantages of continuous manufacturing is transferring to a similar line and having to avoid doing this redevelopment, right? So thanks to these models, we hope that we can cut down these development activities and sort of, predict in silico most of the potential impact of process parameter changes. But we're not quite there yet. So we just started an academic collaboration that will run over the next 3 or 4 years at least. So we don't have a lot of things to talk about at this stage. We have an idea on how to do it, but we're not quite there yet.
Okay. One more question.
Before you do, if I can carry on with your first question, just for clarification. So if you prove that in silico modeling changeability, you're still going to go and do verification?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So we are continuous. It's a question to Sir also. We are continuously monitoring the SUBAC guidelines, okay? So, but there is no update for the continuous manufacturing in the recent update, whatever they have released last year. So, in your pre-NDA or when your NC or NDA got during the gold date, you might have got some queries or responses, right? So what kind of guidance or what kind of guidance you got it from FDA with respect to, when you are changing it from batch manufacturing to continuous manufacturing, again, further process to...
That's an answer that probably require one day. So it's something probably I think we can discuss offline. Because it's been, years and years of experience, and it was one of the first products. So of course there was a lot of questions around, for instance, the use of RTD models, right, in guaranteeing the process robustness. It was a new thing in the industry, so there were a lot of questions, especially from regulators around it. But yeah, there were a lot of things of feedback from the FDA, which will take probably too long to discuss.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I just want to make sure you and the other colleagues in the room understand there is no one size fits all. So it is the responsibility of the manufacturer based on the nature of the API, the nature of the equipment, the nature of the process, the way they are going to run it, et cetera, to develop a strategy of how they plan to implement continuous. And then once you do that, and after you do that, then you go to the agency. Don't expect, even after ICH Q13 is finalized, that there will be a template that guide you in a stepwise approach to do that. I'm sure you understand that, but I think you will have to do it yourself based on your implementation approach. Okay. Okay. Other questions? You are so quiet today. Too much food and wine last night?
There's a question in the back.
Question in the back. All right. Do you have a mic? I'll give you one.
First of all, congratulations on the submission and the approval. So my question was, when this has gone into routine production, have you had to deal with any rejections and recalls and putting your models into application? And then following on from that, if you have, what has been your quality organization's comfort with adopting your model and quarantining a set amount of material?
Right. To my knowledge, we've never been in that situation, so the process has always been run quite smoothly. But I'm not the best person to answer that question, so I will definitely note it down and get back to some people in the organization so we can exchange probably business cards, and I'll get back to your question.
Other questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Justino, for an outstanding presentation. Now we are going to have another real implementation story, and Frank will share his experience from Teva perspective. Frank?
Do we have this pointer for switching?
I think it's working.
Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here, and thanks a lot to Ima for the invitation to this great place. And also thanks a lot for Justino for the great speech. I think this is definitely state-of-the-art what we have in continuous manufacturing for oral solid dosage forms. So I would like to elaborate a little bit on the way to implement and also to validate a continuous manufacturing process, what we did for direct compression tablets. So what you see here is the installation we have installed in Ulm, which is our biggest manufacturing site at Teva, where we meanwhile manufacture several products commercially also. I would like to a little bit show you around the path. Where did we, or how did we get to this routine manufacturing through process design and also the validation part? So generally, it's important that you be aware, and I think you are that, about what it is behind the process validation principles. So in generally, it starts with the user requirement specification, and then you think about how could your system be designed and everything. And at a certain point, you order the equipment, and then you get delivered it, and then it's installed. And when it is installed, the work starts really for the engineers to do the installation, qualification, and operational. And when it comes to performance qualification, then the process development people and the engineers are linked, because then the product is going to the process. And normally this is not a big approach for the batch process, but if we look for the continuous process, it must be done differently, because for continuous manufacturing you have to consider your product even at the first stages of process design. That's very important to know. So we also ask ourselves the question, why continuous manufacturing? And I'm referring a little bit to other industries. So, and this is just an output of a text which was published on a food journal. And they were also saying that the continuous, consistent quality of the product is definitely a benefit for which comes from continuous manufacturing, and also the fact that we have less labor in production. And they mentioned also that it depends on the volume you need to produce. So coming from that perspective, the question is, what is the efficiency we can gain with the continuous manufacturing? So in pharma, okay, of course, we need to consider quality as the biggest aspect, and also the regulatories, but I would like to try to answer this question now to you from our perspective. So the business rationale was for us to have a technology with a high potential of saving in manufacturing costs. That was the rationale behind and the business case justification. We wanted to apply it for a commercial product which was already existing on the market, and therefore we wanted to switch from batch to continuous. No installation in R&D at all. It was set to have an approval requirement with a return on investment of less than 3 years, and after the experience we have, I'm convinced that this is realistic. What is not realistic, what we set as a timeline of 2 years implementation, that was definitely not possible at that time, and I think it's not possible now. General principle for us was keep it simple as possible. That's very important. And what does it mean? So in case of product selection, we decided to go for a product which is really straightforward, which is well established, and it's just, you can see here some points. So the technology should be easy, direct compression. We decided for an NIR installation because we had the NIR competence in-house. That was a huge benefit. The API content, of course, should be high, and the raw material components should not be too many because we try to avoid to have premix and everything. But so it was limited to 5, and that the product quality should be as robust as possible. I think this is self-explaining. Another precondition regarding the business case was to have a high-volume product, and high volume, I'm talking about, let's say, minimum plus 500 million tablets a year. And the raw material characteristics we heard already several times. That is definitely something that needs to be considered also for the dosing. So the strategy we wanted to follow, and we did this, was to stick with a defined batch size, and not only with a fixed batch size. We defined to have a batch size range for that, but at least it was defined batch size. The state of control principle should be applied wherever possible, so we tried to avoid to have the process state in a way that it is too dynamic. So whenever we could have it static, then it should be kept as that. The control strategy was, of course, monitoring all critical process parameters and also the NIR testing on that. Diversion of material was mandatory because otherwise you cannot convince the authorities. That's key. For validation perspective, we defined to go for let's say, a hybrid approach between process-defined implementing into the classical 3-batch validation. In our case, we decided to go not for a real-time release testing, although I would agree to what Justino said, real-time releasing at the final stage brings additional benefit. But for us, it was not part of the strategy. Material traceability was something that needed to be done. So that what was the equipment looked like once we designed it. That's an old picture, but I like it because it's nice, colorful, and you can see everything on it. So you have 5 components. You see it in the containers there, and we have the transfer pipes, which are red. They're transferring the raw materials to the upper level. From there, they were dosed to the mixer, and from the mixer, they are transferred to the next level beyond where the tablet press is standing. So the general straightforward approach that could also be applied for other products. So from a process flow perspective, you can see here a little bit more of the details. What I want to show is the elements for process monitoring and control. So we have all the excipients transferred through vacuum transfer, and then it goes to the dosing unit. So each and every component is dispensed automatically. And here we check the dosing accuracy, which is a big hurdle. I will also elaborate later on it a little bit more. From there, it goes now to the right side to the mixing, and there we also check some parameters, but as I mentioned, these parameters are fixed, and we have an NIR where we check the critical quality attributes also. From there, it passes a product valve. Hopefully, normally it passes, and it's not linked to the rejected goods, what mostly happens, and from there we have two options. One option is to directly go to the tablet press. The other option is to go to a container, which is later on manually put on the tablet press. So the dosing accuracy, why is the problem? Just in brief, because it's hard. It's really important to understand, and one of the most critical aspects if you do the full continuous approach. So if you have around about an output of 1 million tablets, and this is the comparison to the bread again, you end up with a dosing accuracy for one of the low dose components with roughly 0.3 grams per 30 seconds. And this needs to be resolved by a balance, and of course the balance has to be very sensitive to that. And if you compare it to the bread, I think there is not a big issue for the food manufacturing regarding dosing. So this is an additional hurdle that needs to be taken. And why is this a problem? There are two factors that need to be considered. One is the pneumatic issue, because as you work in a closed system and you transfer via vacuum, all the sucking of the material can disturb the balances if you not have a proper de-airing concept. And the other thing is the mechanical decoupling, which is also very important. And we had a hard work to do to really decouple our platform where the dosing units are, because it was always some inexplicable disturbance on that. For example, pallet truck passing by on the corridor or something like that was really giving us a headache, yeah, at the end. So very important. So just on a graph shown how this looks like if you measure the dosing accuracy. You see on the horizontal lines the dosing accuracy, and the bars show the refilling cycles, and just in the middle the big black bar shows the refilling of one of the components, which was a bigger component, so there was 1 kilogram transferred. And whenever this refilling took place for this component, we have a disturbance on all other dosing units for the other components, and that led of course to a rejection of material at the end. Regarding mixing process, we already heard a lot. I think regarding this process, it is very important to know that the residence time distribution has to be known well, and the impact factors on this residence distribution needs to be also developed quite well, because this is at the end assuring the homogeneity of your product. And you yourself need to define in the design phase if you want to vary all those factors, for example, the mixing speed or the output or if you want to stay fixed. So that's very important. So in our case, we decided to keep it fixed because we did not want to go in the design space discussions with the authorities. Regarding NIR installation, of course, at the first point, it is important to know where to install. We decided to do it after the mixer, and then we decided for a Bruker Matrix F, which is a quite known equipment, very well working for these applications. We had at the beginning 2 measuring heads, one after the mixer and the second was before the tablet press, but then we decided to remove one after validation. It was enough. So we tested 3 quality attributes, and what was interesting, once we calculated the amount of product we test, we ended up with roughly 7%. So 7% of the product that passed the window that you can see here on the right downside was measured. And if you compare this with the conventional retain sampling testing, what we have in the batch manufacturing process, it's clear that we have a much better insight on product quality and process. But you need to be aware that method development, and I will later on cover this a little bit more, is much more complicated for such a process than for a batch process, and especially the time aspect needs to be considered for this application, because it makes a difference if you measure for the beginning of the batch, and our batch runs also roughly 3 days, or at the end of this batch. So you need to assure that those values are comparable. If you go for the batch release testing, you always have a same sample. Okay, looking at the next stage, which is a little bit more interlinked with validation, it's important to understand that for the batch process, it is mainly required that you have an analytical method validated before you go for the process validation, and then you do the process validation. For the continuous manufacturing process, it's required to have the analytical method validation as part of the process validation, and this needs to be interlinked with the control strategy. That sounds maybe a little bit cryptic, but at the end, you need to assure the measurements and the testing over time are complying your validation requirements compared to single sample testing requirements. And that makes the validation effort much more complicated compared to the batch validation. So if we look at the control strategy, that is also something that needs to be really taken into consideration, because so if you look at this, the text on the right, so there was is a text out of the FDA draft for quality on continuous manufacturing. There is showing that in general, a developing of a control strategy should consider unexpected variations in the process. That means you need to assure that from batch to batch, you have to look at the variabilities that are taking place, and you need to control them from batch to batch. But, and it's also shown here, for the continuous, it's even more critical, because you have to have your disturbances which are taking place during the process under control. And that's then a totally different story you have to consider. And what are the key elements of this control strategy? So we are not anymore talking about process deviations, equipment breakdowns, and maybe some out-of-spec results in IPC testing. We are now talking about input of incoming material. How is this impacting the rest of the process? How do you define your process monitoring and control? And how do you divert material which is not conforming? And that's already mentioned there, that this is some kind of a requirement that needs to be done, because otherwise, whenever you have an variability, you have to divert the whole batch, and that is not making sense at all. The real-time release testing approach is also mentioned, and also what is very important is the setting of specifications, which I will also elaborate later on a little bit more. The impact of equipment, I think this is self-explaining, is having another dimension compared to the process, because for the batch process, you're just looking if it works or not, and if you have some changes, you do a requalification. But what's happened if you have some unexpected disturbances during during continuous manufacturing. Yeah, and last but not least, and this is one of the hardest points from our perspective for the continuous, is the integration of the system and the processing of the data you generate, which should not be underestimated, because at the end you are generating a lot of data and you need to evaluate and handle and store this data. This is completely different to what is especially compared to a simple direct compression process. So looking at all those things, you can, in a validation, of course, you go for a process risk analysis. And what is definitely something that has to be in this analysis is to check the suitability for the product, for the continuous line, and also the NIR. Are you able to detect everything you want to see? Or are you just generating some chemometric data that is bringing you not a lot of benefit? And by the way, this is also something that is requested by the authorities if you file the analytical method validation. So the PET hardware is okay, that's clear, and all raw materials impact and on critical material attributes, of course, we discussed and heard in several presentations. The dosing accuracy is key, and also the continuous mixing and homogeneity of the product, of course, is key. In our case, we had to deal with vacuum transfer. That is, I think, not the best, but it's okay if you have a higher API content and it fits to the whole particle engineering, then it's okay. But gravimetric feeding would be, I think, more easier. And the rejection system is something that really needs to be defined very precisely, because for our experience, when we filed, we get questions to how do you assure that the product you're testing with the NER is completely diverted with the product valve, and that's not an easy answer there, because you have to generate data, and Justina just mentioned and showed it, and I think maybe one of the assessors was participating in one of the presentations, because he exactly posed these questions, and that was not really easy, because if you have the product valve which is close to your mixer, you have the whole data processing from the testing to the valve reaction has to be exactly engineered, and it has to be shown that no product which is tested as a bad or a out of spec product is ending up in your confirming product. That's not easy, but it works, and at the end you benefit with a good process understanding and with a reliable process. So the approach for the quality by design, which we did for the past part, it's just a principle thing. So of course you start to define which are your critical quality attributes and which process parameters are impacting those, and then you just have to see what technology is the best for that. And when you have decided on that, you can go for the chemometric modeling and the design of this, and also of course the position of the testing and the monitoring principle. And at the end, you should have a kind of control strategy which is again interlinked with the process itself. So that just shows that it's not just an developing of an analytical method, it's developing of a system, and that's the main difference. So if you just see at this graph here, we are generating data, for example, for API and starch and water content, because we know their impact on the critical quality attributes. Then it's good to have this data, but what are you doing with this data, and how do you handle it, and what are you doing if you have what are you doing if you have some outliers? Is this already a deviation, or if this has to be handled maybe as a kappa, or is it without any impact? So all these investigations need to be done, and therefore it is very important to set specifications for reacting on those data, and to interlink this with the control system. And here is an example for the control of our dosing units, and it's quite similar for the PAT installation. With the NIR is that we check the dosing accuracy, for example, every second, and when we have a mean value out of this for 30 seconds, and we continuously monitor these values with two limits. One is a warning limit, and the second is an alarm limit. And then you have a statistical evaluation behind that when you are forced to switch the valve to rejected products, and what you can accept if the value is out of warning limit. And that's key of the process design, because you cannot imagine, and that's what we also experience, if you set those limits too tight. It's normally the easiest way to be quality-wise on the safe side. Just set it to 0.1%, for example. Then you will end up with a yield loss in your batch, which is unacceptable high. And then the engineering people are coming and say, okay, why can't we put it to 1%? But if you have 1% variability in your excipients dispensing, and you add the other excipients together, then you end up with 3 to 4, and you have immediately a problem with the assay in your blend and in your tablets later on. So that needs to be really critically viewed at and defined. So when it then comes to process validation, we follow the general approach, which I think is everybody doing, based on an FMEA, which is coming out of the process design phase. We implemented, as part of our validation data, we implemented the monitoring data for our critical process parameters, which we have for the whole batch. The blend uniformity data, of course, which are coming from the NIR, was also used, and this was cross-validated with conventional blend uniformity sampling, which means taking samples out of bins. And it was also cross-validated with HPLC testing. That was, by the way, also part of the method validation. So you see the method validation, analytical method validation, and process validation was interlinked during validation batch manufacturing. And it was not, as it is for the batch approach, before process validation to be done. Something different. Of course, we did an enhanced sampling for blend uniformity and continuous content uniformity, because you have a big batch. It's not enough to have only 10 samples for blend. And the operation range and the design space, if you have one, and we try to reduce, as I mentioned, you also have to clearly validate. And one of the ranges we set is a batch size range. So we wanted to be flexible with our batch size, and in our case it was 1,000 to 10,000 kilograms, and this you need to consider in your validation. So we validated 1 ton up to 10 ton with a systematic approach to cover the whole range. But as we heard at the early beginning yesterday, you have to fix your batch size before you start the process. You are not allowed to stop whenever you think it's time for a break or whatever. This would be the easiest. The it would be beneficial if you have a breakdown just to say, okay, let's stop the batch and sell that, but it's not possible at all. So you have to fix it before you start. Key. But it's okay, that's not a problem. And we also defined to have a certain range for the output. In this case, it was 100 to 150 kilograms. This was due to technical reasons, because in our case, we had a kind of a big bag for some raw materials, and we needed to interchange the big bags. And to have enough time to change the big bags, we needed to reduce the speed of the line to avoid stopping of this of the process. What is also very important, that is shown here, and I think it's mentioned also already, but I want to again highlight it because it's an impact. The validation of the of start and stop scenarios is something that is new compared to the batch process. So because you have to know what is happening when you start the system, and if you can, it's easy to imagine if you start a continuous process as we have it here, where you dispense the raw materials, you do not start with perfect homogeneity in the mix. That will not work. So it takes some time, and if you can see what you can see here on the graph, it's just simplified the assay values from starch and the API over time, and in blue you can see the valve action. So we started where we have a high disturbance in the API assay, and then that was okay. And green, you see the starch, it went up and then it went down, and the valve just reacted on that. So what we then did as a consequence, we defined, not only based on this data, but based on much more data, a certain time that is needed until the system is running in a steady state. And again, you need to confirm your diversion of product. That was also said yesterday, and I think it's good to mention it again, because it's another huge approach that should not be underestimated. And clean hold time itself, but dirty hold time is something that is very, very important, because cleaning of such an equipment is a much higher effort than cleaning just the bin and the tablet press. And when it comes to production, the production managers always asking on, let's extend the hold time for the dirty equipment, because we don't want to clean it, we want to reuse it in 4 weeks again. And if you spend 4 days, we are currently in 1 shift or 2 shifts just for cleaning the system, you can imagine that this is an important question. Okay, so intermediate hold time, of course, because you're not testing one, you're not producing one, you're testing 10 batches. Bulk hold time and validation of campaign length is also important, and the most important thing, which is always or very often forgotten, is the revalidation of the models, PAT models. And the responsibility for that, is it still QC, or is the responsibility switching to the manufacturing people, where there is, of course, in most of the cases, no expertise? Yeah. Stage 3, which is the continuous process verification, is for continuous manufacturing a easy stage, because you already continuously check the critical parameters. And I would just show you some pictures of our installation, how it looks and how we operate the system. So it's shown here. On the right side, you see the control units where people can dock to the SAP, to the Brooker, and also to the continuous control unit. This is just a picture of how it looks, and we have installed this in the mixing room as well as in the compression room, because those people in compression also need to know what's happening in the stairs, in the floor above. We operate the system currently still with one operator, but we are reducing it to temporary because it runs very smoothly and not all the time a person has to be there. So we will reduce to every 3 hours just for changing the raw material bins. Batch size I mentioned, output is linked to the output of the tablet press because this is the limiting factor. Otherwise, we could have an output with our system up to 400 kilograms, which we apply for another product. The operator instructions and back documentation is done with electronic batch record. That's also nice because it can be accessed from everywhere, also from the supervisor room. Raw material, that space, and the mean residence time, which we calculated for the mix, just from early starting till the end of the mixing, is around about 40 minutes and 130 for the product transferring until it comes out of the tablet press. And that's mainly driven by buffer containers, which are in between. Otherwise, it would be 2 minutes. We have an additional interface for the compression that's mentioned, and another NIR background measurements. We did the big bag containers every 3 hours, and the yield is also an issue. And I have a picture for the yield because that is at the end supporting the efficiency. Because if you have a nice continuous process where you have a reduced quality testing at the end, but you lose 5% of the batch on the way because it's diverting the product too often, then you have gained nothing at the end. So what we have shown here on a graph is that's just a result of the continuous process verification, the improvement of the reduction of the valve actions, and the resulting improvement of the yield over the past. And we are currently operating with above 99% of yield, even more. So if we look at the benefits, that is not exactly representing what we have as a postulate with the food article. So we see the benefits in manufacturing not in terms of efficiency. We see the benefits in process understanding there, but if you look back now and calculate the manufacturing times, it's mainly a little bit more effort there on the mixing step compared to the batch manufacturing, because the batch manufacturing process in our case was very easy, and now somebody has to do a little bit more than before. But this will see it's still 10%, and if we go to the situation that no operator is permanently at the line, we will also have a benefit there, but that's really the latest state. For compression, it's a little bit better because you do not have the changeovers between all those small batches. And main savings are coming from our calculation out of the QC testing, because there we have a much lesser effort than we had in the past, and it would be even more if we go for the real-time release testing at the end. But of course, you need to invest in this technology, and that takes also time and money. But at the end, we roughly calculate, and this is also confirmed with other products, that the manufacturing costs, and this is of course without any material costs, can be improved of roughly 50% if it runs perfect at the end. Okay, just an outlook, and going back to the bakery, they also thought, why to have a full continuous? Maybe it's also worse to have only a semi-continuous, and in their case, they were thinking about kneading process not in a continuous manner, because you have also to, let's say, store the stuff for a certain time for swelling and everything. So they think about having the first step batch-wise and the rest on a continuous. And the benefits out of this are also quite similar from their perspective. And what could this mean for pharmaceutical manufacturing? You can see here, for example, if you're not dispensing all excipients, or you're just having a granule, you could add the granule and the outer phase with the dosing system and have the NIR installed where you divert then the mix and check if it's okay or not. Go to compression, and then if you look at the to the coating, and then if you look for the coating there, if you still have a batch coating process, you will lose at the end all what you gain in the steps before. So you have to separate your continuous big batch into small batches again, and in the worst case, you have to test them all again. And one option there would also be regarding continuous manufacturing to have a continuous coating at the end, and this will bring you then the benefits for testing and efficiency on the shop floor too. So just to summarize, process design is key for that, and validation effort is increased. That's absolutely clear. You have to integrate the analytical method validation, and what is not should not be underestimated is the shift later on in production from QC to manufacturing. The benefit is the responsibility they have and their awareness on quality they have on the shop floor later on. So in our case it was, and that's also mentioned already, and it's confirmed for us, we have an improved quality, we have a much more robust product. We have reduced manufacturing costs due to QC savings, and we have also reduced cycle time. And from our view, we are now looking on where can we apply semi-continuous approaches to other processes we have in our site and in other sites in the Teva network. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank. Very clear. Questions? Yes.
Frank, you mentioned that you run the operation with one operator per shift.
Yep.
I wonder how do you do the verification of the second person? Is that electronically, or is the second person just dropping by to verify?
There is in routine no second person coming to check additional. So the system is validated as it is no second person checked needed for that. That was a huge discussion with our quality, obviously, and at the end we could convince them, as we did it also automatically, and there was no process generated that needed to be checked because it was checked by the system and validated in a computer system. We were able to do that. But to be honest, the release process for the QPs or for the quality people has more effort because they have to look at much more data at the end of the batch. Yeah.
Hi. So very glad to see that you have the batch size up to 10K. So I would like to understand what is the process capability, CPK, for the entire process.
So we have the CPK data, of course, for all the critical attributes, and they are far above 2. So the lowest, I think, is 2.0. So it's very robust and constant.
How is that CPK compared to batch, since you're doing batch?
So especially looking at the dissolution part, where we had in the batch some variabilities, it is much better in the continuous process. It was not too bad in the batch process at all, but what we see now is that the variability is much lower. So in the past we had, let's say, CPK from 1.3 to 2 and somebody 3. And now we are constantly on a steady.
Okay.
I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
What kind of holdups are you seeing in your system? About how much mass is held up throughout the entire line?
Which one, sorry?
Just wondering about the mass holdup in the line. I see that you got a very fast throughput compared to
Yeah.
stuff I'm used to, and you got a long residence time. Do you have a lot of material that's held through the line?
Yeah, so we have at certain points the buffer containers in between to assure that for example, if the compression machine or the tablet press has a stop, that we do not have to stop the whole system, and that's why we need to put some buffer in between after the mixing step and also prior to the compression again. Mm-hmm. And that was also an outcome out of routine manufacturing, because we knew we had a buffer in the early beginning, about 200 kilo, but we learned very fast that this is too small, because it was very obvious that after a short breakdown of the tablet press, this buffer was full, and then the whole line has to stop. And if I mentioned, if you haven't stopped, you lose material and you have to restart, where you again lose some material, and that's need to be avoided. That's why we increased the buffer in between. Yeah.
Okay, and you run the tallow press extra fast to bring the material in the buffer down, or do you just build up over the course of the batch?
No, it's the tablet press is running at the level which is exactly the linked to the output of the system. So it normally should be equal, but of course, if there is some disturbance, then it changes again.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. The question is possible to think to a low dosage API for this kind of process?
Theoretically, it's of course possible, but it's much harder to realize, because one of the limitations, as I mentioned, is the dosing. The second limitation you have is the accuracy of the NIR testing. And this, in combination, gives you a real hard task to build up a control strategy that is reliable, bringing you the product quality at the end without any additional testing. That's from our perspective.
Especially if you are not using gravimetric control, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
I think you talked a little bit about it, but just trying to get a little more clarity on pneumatic transfer can have a huge and profound effect on the accuracy of your feeders. What steps did you take to actually mitigate that risk in pneumatic transfer?
What we did is and I think maybe you saw it on the pictures. We did install additional de-airing filters to avoid that the vacuum is directly sucked to the dosing units. So if you install some filters where the air is then sucked through instead of directly going to the dosing units, then it works quite well. But the position of this de-airing installations need to be designed precisely. And to be honest, at the beginning we did not have any of these de-airing filters, and we just added them from time to time on different positions. And yeah, but with filters it works. Yeah.
All right, sorry. Is it transfer plug flow, or is it?
It's on a platform.
But sorry, is it plug flow or the pneumatic transfer?
It's a platform, yeah.
All right. Other questions? If not, once again, great presentation, Frank. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. I have some good news. We are ahead in time, which doesn't happen often, especially in the second day. So it is 11:03 now. So I would like you back here at 20 after 11. Okay? I think it's important to have 10 minutes of buffer or so. I would like you to be back 20 after 11. and I don't have an assistant to come and get you here to this room today. So I will see you in 15 minutes. Thank you.
I've been at EMA for 29 years, and I always felt part of this group. I never thought of leaving the company, even for a moment. I feel like those players who play for the same team their entire life. Chroma is an attempt to get less conventional and be less mainstream. It means not following someone else's path, but going our own way instead, a new way. After all, EMA has a duty to innovate. The first time I saw this machine, I thought about the future, because coating in the future will be flexibility at the highest level. And this, for me, is the idea at the heart of Chroma, the hallmark of this project. Just think, Chroma can be equipped with up to 4 coating modules capable of working in series or in parallel, and with different settings. The result? A very flexible machine in terms of configuration and performance. I don't have the technical skills, but I would champion this approach every day. And this is what I do, with my vision and my intuition. And after all, as my father used to say, if you are the smarter person in the room, you are in the wrong room. That's why my team is made up of people who complement each other, thanks to their different skills.
in charge of mechanical design for the machinery department of the EMA Active division. This includes research and development, industrialization and customization for the client. Chroma is one of the most important R&D projects that I've ever managed. Because it's a big change, it's a break with the past and a completely new beginning. A rare opportunity in a world that generally progresses through incremental innovation. Chroma is a machine that simply wants to break with the past, a blank sheet of paper that has become reality. In a batch coating machine, the tablet is exposed to the spray for just a few seconds. Each tablet is drowned inside the fluid mass. So, how does Chroma work? We have lowered the layer of the product bed within the drum. That way, the tablets are always exposed to the spray. To do this, the mass is less fluid and more effort is needed to move it. The most extreme option would mean treating the tablets one by one, which is exactly what happens in tablet presses and capsule filling machines. We haven't got to that point yet, but we came very close. I personally believe that the real challenge for future coating processes will be the control, interpretation, and use of the great amount of information that will be available to us using PAT technologies.
I started with this company 20 years ago. It all started with my thesis for chemistry and pharmaceutical technology. It was a thesis on coating. I'm a determined and meticulous kind of person, so it's no surprise that I love doing triathlons. And in everything I do, I always end up having to deal with timings and planning, both in my work and in sport. That's why at Chroma I am a project facilitator. I coordinate all the different departments, keep an eye on testing, plan the meetings. Chroma is incredible. It has something that other machines simply don't. What I find really interesting and unique about this machine is that the drawer-based system for transferal between the modules is really simple. An intuition that essentially allows us to make sure there is a constant flow of tablets from one module to the next. It really is a machine that can just keep going and going. I imagine the coating of the future to be extreme. Extreme parameters for treating cores in high pressure and temperature conditions, so the cores dry instantaneously. What I really liked about this project is its complexity, the multidisciplinarity of the people involved in it. Chroma is like a puzzle that's just missing the last few pieces, and our clients will have to be the ones to put those pieces in.
I take care of the assembly, trials and mechanical and electrical testing for Chroma. I am a practical kind of guy.
I take care of the design side of things in terms of the dimensioning of the machine. I run studies to decide what kinds of tests to do. Then I analyze the results and think about how to improve the machine. I deal with the theory. Fabio and I work together. I like the understanding we have. He is very enthusiastic. And when he doesn't understand something, he asks me for explanations and really insists until everything's crystal clear.
Our aim is to make Chroma a success. And every day, Yola manages to translate what I see in the field into formulas. Her formulas are the whole reason for what I do in the lab.
Chroma is my first project. It's an idea that I've watched come up from nothing and really take shape. I guess you could say it's my life's work.
For me, it's a new philosophy. After years spent working on batch coating machine, it took me a while to get into the world of continuous coating.
The difficult thing about a continuous process is making sure that the first tablet to go in is also the first to come out, and treating all of them in the exact same way. We call it first in, first out. We've spent a lot of time doing research on residence time to ensure that all the tablets are treated in the same way.
The ultimate goal is to make the process perfectly repetitive.
In the future, coating will be completely automated and self-managed. I imagine a future in which the machine just works 24 hours per 7, continuously, where people barely have to do anything to keep it running.
I wake up at 6:15 a.m. There's nobody around at that hour. It's my favorite time of the day. It's when I work best. I'm in charge of developing the automation of Chroma, mostly the sensor and the PAT controls. So it's dealing with assembly and testing issues. And there are days when I shut myself in the lab from morning to evening, just to do tests on the machine. Working on the Chroma project has been a challenge that we've invented from the ground up. Chroma is a new concept of automation. It's a machine that is complex and simple at the same time. For example, at the start, I thought we'd have needed some kind of incredible computer to handle it. But in the end, all we had to do was expand our perspective and look at a new control system. A crucial point in this project was keeping the flow rate of the tablets constant. And it took time to develop the algorithm that manages the overflow of tablets. But that's just another thing that makes us pioneers in the world of continuous production. I see the future as us having to constantly engage with intelligent automation, which is capable of regulating itself and which is connected to the structures of the plant. Because at the end of the day, continuous production means connection between machines, between us and our clients.
I started at EMA in 1995 as a designer. I was in the technical office for about 4 years. Then I happened to take part in a few client meetings, and from that moment on, my adventure in sales and marketing took off. Product manager, then area manager, and key account manager. And finally, for a few years now, I have been sales and marketing director. As sales director, I oversee the marketing of the Chroma project. I get into the office at 8:30 a.m. and immediately start dealing with emails, meetings, and worldwide sales network. I spend the rest of my time on business trips. I travel for around 90 days of the year. Let's just say that my days never get boring or repetitive. What I love about Chroma is its extreme versatility, its ability to establish productive connection in any direction. I remember the interest that the concept created at Interpack 2017 and the CHEMA 2018. I saw such curiosity in the eyes of our clients. The best thing for a seller is to be able to present their clients with a strong idea, a revolution, a breakthrough product. And Chroma is just that, and so much more. The way I see it, Chroma is light years ahead of its time. I mean, as I often say, the future starts today, not tomorrow. The winning formula of this project is the fact that it's impossible to tell where one person's contribution ends and another team member's begins, because talent lets you win games, but teamwork lets you win championships.
IMA is conscious engineering. It transforms global ideas into real and sustainable action. Since 1961, we have been designing and producing automatic packaging machines for tea, coffee, medication, food, cosmetics, and much more. Leadership is in our DNA, and today we are planning the fourth industrial revolution. Tomorrow's solution are today's focus. With courage and enthusiasm, we foresee new market trends. By doing so, we can develop growth opportunities while respecting the most transparent rules of the market. We cultivate knowledge to transform it into culture. We generate innovative technology through constantly changing processes. We are enlightened by an idea. we design a project and develop competencies and solutions. As such, we create sophisticated manufacturing plants of the highest efficiency and reliability. In order to grow, we invest in research. We collaborate with specialized centers and universities. We believe in talent and scrutinize disciplines such as engineering, electronics, computer science, chemistry, physics, robotics, industrial design. We pursue the digital culture. All of this guarantees a customized user experience of our plants. We care about every detail with an engineering approach. Thought, passion, experience, they make engineering our art. Only the best synergy between components can guarantee efficiency, precision and security. We are the heart and mind of a network of highly specialized companies. As catalysts of firms that operate on their territory of origin, we give value to the competencies of each participant. Our transnational teams generate intelligent synergies, designed for the business in whichever direction it takes its course. We are responsible toward the environment and the community. We respond to the most uncompromising international standards and apply the regulations stringently. We make sustainable development tangible. We believe in solid and constructive relations. We favor change. We support exchanges between workers, clients, suppliers and collaborators. We listen and build relationships based on trust because they spark common growth. Our clients are the driving force of and the partners in our mission. We create the product together, and once the installation is finished, the project continues thanks to our professionals ready to give assistance all over the world. Ingenuity is our greatest talent. We use the best tools from the information society and then share them with you. All of this is EMA.
More presentations, and I'm very pleased to introduce Alan Johnston from Emerson. I think we heard about control strategy, data management, automation, and I think Alan has a big task. He will try to connect all these things together. Alan?
Okay, thank you. Buongiorno. Good morning. Thank you very much to EMA for making or putting on the event, for inviting me. I'm going to take or present from a slightly different perspective now. So I'm not a process engineer. I'm coming from an automation and a technology perspective. What I would say is that the last day and a half for me as an automation guy has been absolutely fascinating to see and to listen to the process side of things and to understand the rate and the impact that continuous manufacture is going to have to the pharmaceutical market is truly impressive. The other thing I'd say is that towards the end of the second day, I was sitting there reflecting that all of the material I've got has now been consumed, and what do I say? Which, from an automation point of view, is actually, I thought about it, is actually really good, because automation is an enabling technology, and if we're looking at and covering the requirements that you guys have already described, then we're in the right place. So it was quite alarming at first, but turned out to be the right thing. Whilst the title says control strategies, I will go into that and I'll look at it. But what I wanted to do was just touch on as well automation and control and technology from a bit of a broader perspective as well. Because one of the themes I took from yesterday was innovation, that there's a lot of innovation going on. Well, in automation and process control, there is also an awful lot of automation going on right now. Our side of the industry is changing at a massive rate of knots, as quick as I could ever remember. And I think it's important to reflect on that, and there are some values and some benefits that can be gained by pharmaceutical manufacturing from continuous manufacture. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to touch on that. So, a lot of these we've spoken about for the last, over the last day or so, but from an automation point of view, we need to know and understand what the trends are and respond accordingly. And if you look at this, there are things like the variety of products with a smaller market. So we're talking about modularization, we're talking about integration of OEMs, integration of data. Data, you'll see, is a recurring theme through what I talk about today. So data is everything. It's all about collecting the right data, managing the right data, visualizing the right data. Pharma 4.0, I'm not going to go through all of these, by the way, is a really big thing for us in automation. And I just wanted to touch on that in a little bit more detail later. Things like personalized medicine, cell and gene therapy, moving towards traceability and absolute traceability. We looked at, and we've spoken a lot about time to market, cost-effective compliance, and how that affects what we do. And also, for me, security. So we're creating a lot of data on that. The success of our product is relying on data and the security of that data and the appropriate use of it. Why are we striving to change, to improve things? Well, based on those trends, for manufacturers and users who adopted a lot of those trends and have adopted things like world-class manufacturing, are seeing a significant improvement in what they do. Significant improvement in things like right first time, turnaround of work in progress, manufacturing cycle times have been reduced significantly, and capacity utilization is significant. And I believe they're all contributing factors to continuous manufacture. Same with transforming manufacturing, where we look at some of the challenges that we've had in the industry around clinical approvals or loss or unavailable information, then automation is supporting that. Outsourcing of process development, consolidating integrated data across the life cycle, modularization, again, a recurring theme, technology transfer, we've heard a lot about that over the last 2 days. Inventory and operations management, so I'll talk a little bit more around flexible manufacturing lines later, continuous processing, moving in-line and at-line analysis, outsourcing manufacturing and reliable operations, and then quality and compliance. Real-time release is all about how we analyze and how we use data, release by exception, I'll show you an example of closed-loop controlling against quality-critical attributes and using the data for electronic reviews. I put this in just to give you an idea of what we face from an automation perspective. All of these are pretty much, I don't know whether you've heard of or you're aware of Industry 4.0 or digitalization. That plays a large part in automation for us now and in the future. It's very broad, so no one person will stand here and say, we understand all of this and we know it all, we can do it all and we deliver it all. But there are key contributing factors in there. So data or Pharma 4.0 around the interconnectivity of devices, around collecting data, around vertical and horizontal integration of data, around smart visualization, so how you can actually see and use data and information. These are all integral parts of Pharma 4.0. So virtual reality, digital twin, being able to replicate things in a digital environment or superimpose digital onto the physical world, on using artificial intelligence, knowledge-based systems, self-learning systems. They're all factors, they're all enabling technologies, but ultimately they're supporting some of the key drivers that our industry sees. Operational efficiency, so using data, digital workflows, around flexible manufacturing, how we can, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, around asset utilization, being able to simulate and use digital asset for scale up and quality and compliance. Just, it gives you a flavour of what we're using to support overall improvement. So why automate? Well, some of these are technologies that are available now that are making the automation or more effective, having a greater impact. So everybody sort of talks about the cloud, around making all of this data available at a higher level and then being able to perform data analytics on it, being able to visualize. Virtualization, the power of computing now means that we can put a lot of resource in a single machine rather than having an enormous footprint. Visualization, so being able to look at and view data. It comes back to sort of the millennials of today where they've got smart devices, they can look at whatever data they want and they need when they want it, wherever they want it. Rather than having a fixed screen somewhere in a stainless steel panel. Digital twin and augmented reality, so being able to replicate, being able to superimpose digital onto the real world. I won't go through all of them, we don't have time, but again, cybersecurity is a big, we're creating all that data, it has to be robust. So coming on to continuous manufacturing, and again, these are all points that I think I've certainly heard over the last day or so, but satisfying quality critical attributes. So quality by design for unit operations, inline measurements, effective and efficient startup, so reducing the time to start up and shut down, and that where it's applicable for process, it's exactly the same for automation. We need to have slick and refined processes and software available to support that. Material traceability, so a full genealogy of where product's coming from, where it's gone to, what's happened to it, and the data records. That's event-based, but also now time-based as well. New strategies for unit operations, so with the improvement in processing power, is being able to push intelligence down to a lower and lower level rather than having lots of interfaces and bringing data up. And it's also been able to integrate all those islands of information. Being able to use smart analytics and simulation and predictive modeling to be able to assess the impact of deviation and change. feed forward and feed backwards. So interaction between upstream and downstream, being able to understand the impact of what potentially could happen. Being able to accommodate variability, so not just reactive control, but what's the impact before it happens. Maximizing uptime, so having visibility of not just the process performance, but diagnostics of the equipment, and managing the utilization. So one of the areas of focus we've looked at is how to make the most from each of your manufacturing facilities. So being able to cleverly and real-time schedule equipment use, facility use, people, all in the same algorithm to remove as much white space as possible. And that's real-time and dynamic. We're working on a system at the moment. So if there are any disturbances, any disruption, it automatically regenerates those schedules. So what are the benefits of automating the process? Well, firstly, being able to integrate the system, having a common platform to work on. So the same look and feel, the same sort of visualization, the same data, minimizing the training, being able to take development from a conceptual stage to commercial scale. Clearly that's a different sort of discussion when we're talking about continuous manufacture. Equipment flexibility, I'll show that in a little bit more detail, but being able to extract and remove equipment where the software has to replicate and follow that. I think a point that was made yesterday as well, and it's something that we're working on as well at the moment, is around common integration, so around standards, around how we can connect devices with the minimum risk, so taking a complete validation approach. Compliant, local and defensible position, so basing the development on standards, on known principles, on known practices, on tested and modular pieces of code. Material traceability, being able to track and record exactly what component parts made each of the batches, and having a robust system that records that, including batch reporting as well, so almost inherently and automatically generating that for you. Minimal customization, so I think Lawrence touched on it yesterday, and it's something that I'm quite keen on as well, is taking the equivalent of an S88 model, so building a modular software structure that's fixed. It becomes a library function, so when you reinstantiate that, it's the minimum amount of effort to be able to redevelop or recreate. And that's completely compliant across the whole system architecture. So now we're talking about one system across the whole of the manufacturing process. User-friendly, so a little bit softer, but it removes the risk of error, where it's the same look and feel across the whole software platform, not different platforms with different operator interfaces. It's all exactly the same. You can start the process from a common place because it's all integrated. And if need be, it can be a single place too. So all the data is available. It's a single place to review and monitor the process. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because I think we've seen this sort of picture a lot of times. But the point I'd make on here is that, and I think Frank touched on it as well, is that where you end up with almost potentially a hybrid system of batch, semi-batch, and continuous, is having the capability to take data from all of those unit operations and store it in a common place, but it's contextualized. It has the right context so that subsequent analysis is possible across all of the different units and unit operations. And again, we've spoken about this a lot, but the simplicity of batch processing against continuous brings the processing time right down, but it's having the data available to analyze that. So we come to this point where we've now got, or been able to embed a lot of analytics in a multiple of different controlling devices, but they're all complementary. So now we've got an awful lot of information, but it's all connected, it's all working together, it's all dependent. There's an awful lot more level of detail in order to understand what's going on in the process, but also in terms of advanced process control, to understand how each of these different components interact with each other. And I'll show you an example, a very simple example, by the way, in a minute. In terms of flexibility, we've seen this quite a lot, or we talked about it, but being able to create components, units, and modules, and take them out and remove them, or use them somewhere else, or be able to reinstate them. The same thing has to happen from a software point of view as from a hardware point of view. In most automation systems now, if we have a common platform, we'll have a common library. The common library equipment classes can be tested, can be validated, and therefore can be reused. It's the same with the interfaces, having common standard interfaces. So being able to remove a piece of software or a module with its inherent software with the minimum amount of rework required. Again, it comes back to the philosophy of S8T8, so having standard functionality and standard interfaces. So it comes back, we would talk about the plug and play standardization, and that's something that we are actively involved in at the moment, working out how best to do that from an equipment point of view and from a software point of view. There are solutions there now, but they're probably not as elegant as they're going to be as the technology develops and standards move on. And again, being able to take the data and collect it and have it in one single form or one single place, irrespective of where you've used the equipment and where the product is. So, in terms of control strategy, I just wanted to give you a simple or a very basic overview or example. So in this example, we want to be able to manage things like the optimum product, tablet hardness, blending consistency. But in order to do that, we need to understand what the critical process parameters, what the quality critical attributes are, what relationship they have to each other, and how they're actually going to be measured. So, and again, we've talked about sort of modeling a lot this morning, but it's essential to have that level of information. There are challenges and complexities from an automation perspective in that there may be multiple critical process parameters, there may be multiple quality critical attributes, and they all have a complete independency on each other. But at the same time, they've got to keep the product within the design space. There's also then the added complication of process variability, and again, there are people a lot more better qualified than me to talk about or the way that the process works. But as an automation, from an automation perspective, how do we accommodate that? Continuous manufacturing, it brings a lot of benefits and advantages from an automation perspective. Because we've got a much higher degree of analysis, we can detect, it's much more detectable, it's much more measurable. It allows, therefore, the greater opportunity to optimize the control and to be able to real-time manage the sort of trajectory of the product, if you like. I quite like this statement that the data acquisition or the data available is it is a much richer source of data and information. So data density, information per kilogram of materials, I think that's great. there's a level of adaptation. So we can use that data, we can optimize models for a much more consistent control. And it's specifically 100% of the product can be inspected and measured. So what do we need to do to make this happen? So we need to develop our prediction model. We need to be able to measure the frequency at which we're going to use our detection equipment, our analyzers, derived from the residence time distribution, so just to make sure that we capture at the right frequency, at the right rate, the right information. Data management, how do we need our system to be able to manage the models, to be able to manage the data, to be able to perform on the predictions that it's creating in the controlling devices. Has to be integrated to the overall control system. And then we need to be able to implement a control model to be able to take into account all those variances of dynamics. So, fairly simple system, fairly basic architecture, to be perfectly honest, where a DCS will run all of the controlling software. Analyzer will be able to detect or measure the process performance, and an interface to the actual controllers of each of the devices. We need to understand what the control requirements are. So we want to be able to measure or maximize the product rate. We want to be able to control the ratio of the API, the excipient, the lubricant. It's got to be within the equipment specs, and we want to be able to meet the percentage API specification for the feeders. For the blenders, it's all around uniformity, and to be able to accommodate feeder rate variability, to be able to measure the actual product uniformity. For the tablet press, the level, the compression, and the weight of the tablets. So these are all parameters that need to be taken into account by our control system. And then, of course, all those are independent or interdependent. So a low level in the compression machine, so that it affects the turret speed affects the feed rates affect the blender speed. So it's all interdependent. The way that we look at doing this is around, if we took conventional control, so a reactive control where the output of a controller is directly proportional to the input or the error that it's measured. Very difficult to do that with interdependencies that we've just described. If you take a multivariable predictive control approach, you've now got the opportunity to take all of the related measurements, integrate the measurement outputs, and then determine what dependency they've got on each other. So it takes into account the interactions of each of the measured values. It takes into account the modeling and the prediction of what potentially is going to happen to each of those deviations. And it also gives an element of optimization. So from that model as it is now, we can run it. The model can be optimized. We need to know, for example, in this example, what the relationship is between all the measured variables or the manipulated variables and the controlled variables. Without that, we've got no multivariable control. Again, this is a very simple example. Once we know those, we can plot those in a model predictive controller. Dynamic control matrix. So within here, we can include every single relationship and every single effect between all the relevant or between all the process inputs and outputs. Looks very simple there, but it's quite a challenging task. So ultimately, once we've built that, we've now got our model predictive control on our system. So everything that we've described now lives in a model predictive controller, but it manages all of the other controls, all the other parameters. So the flow for the feeders and the pre and main compression forces, the fill depth, the fill weight, are all now directly linked through a model predictive controller. Using this, we can use an algorithm called linear programming, and it interprets all those rules, and it extrapolates based on the performance of the performance characteristics where the optimum operating is going to be based on the measured and controlled variable limits. It can't take you outside of the limits, of course. The system can only do what it can do. But the idea is based on those requirements. The algorithm will work out exactly where the optimum operating point is. It's normally at an intersection between at least one or two of the lines. So in this instance, we've maximized the throughput given the constraints that we've got. Great, maximizes profit, of course. But that's not always going to be fixed. So for example, it may well be that the operation is around throughput and energy, where there's a compromise of energy and throughput. There might be times, though, where you're behind on manufacturing throughput and you're prepared to forfeit or compromise some of the energy usage. So that model will change. It will allow energy usage to go up in order to increase the throughput. Okay. I just very briefly wanted to touch on, from an automation and a systems perspective, the PAT system. So essentially, the PAT system performs or provides three types of information around quality prediction, around fault detection, and then using our model predictive controller around actually controlling the process and optimization. So a lot of functionality there and a lot of information. We want to, or we see things moving towards a more integrated PAT management system, where all of these requirements, again, there's a lot to read there, but we want to satisfy those, but we want to satisfy it in a completely integrated system. Why do we want to do it? Because the architecture at the moment has room for improvement. It can become better. So it's made up of quite a number of component parts. Therefore, it's made up of a number of different databases and a different number of controlling mechanisms. So for us to deploy, it makes it quite challenging. It's difficult to implement. It's fairly difficult to maintain. It potentially has two sources of the truth, or a different number of batch records. It'll have different operator interfaces. And the perception is, as we come back to sort of cyber security and things, it's less secure. And in terms of the automation levels, this is what it looks like. So from the source of data all the way through to being able to analyze the information, there are a number of interfaces and a number of places that can the data can reside. Where do we see it going? As I say, the technology is allowing it now to be a much more integrated system, so everything in one place. It's easier to use, it's easier to maintain. We standardize on models and libraries because it's all there in the same place. But it's not quite there yet. It's still work in progress, so it's still around innovation. We'd like to think, and I think it was mentioned yesterday, OPC UA is the interface, the universal interface moving forwards, but not everybody has that right now. potentially there's no raw data around because it's been brought in and it's been processed. And it's certainly not proven in the market just yet. But it's a vision, and it eliminates a lot of the challenges that we saw previously. So there is a single place for it to for operator interfaces. There isn't any duplicity of operation. It gets rid of any driver issues and data management issues. The other sort of point is that we've looked at how do you embed different models for different sensors. So sensors will now be integrated at the controller level, not through its own server. But again, not there yet, but this is a nice to be. This is where we would like to be. And what does it look like? As you can see, same functionality, but it's all now being pushed down into a controller level, so it becomes one piece of software. Sort of comes back to what I was saying earlier around how do we manage, so what are the challenges around using different unit operations? There's variance between all of the unit operations that we spoke about earlier. There's the challenge around coordinating unit operations. If they sit in their own entity in their own right with their own controllers, then there's a challenge around how do you synchronize those, how do you schedule those, how do you interface to them. Batch reporting, so how do you take data from each of those different devices or controllers and integrate it into one single homogeneous database. It becomes challenging around tracking and tracing, around materials for consumption through a whole process. But if we start looking at a completely integrated control system, a lot of those issues start to move away, where there is a standard interface. It reduces the challenge or the issues around interfacing and gaining data, bringing it into a single place. Clear boundaries of accountability, so it becomes very clear in terms of system delivery, who's responsible for what and what standards are they going to use. There is no gap in the middle where we've worked on projects before where everybody's comfortable with their own bit, but how do you plug it all together? And as we said before, even from a batch context point of view, all of the data is now being contextualized appropriately and is being brought into a single place for data analytics from subsequently. Heard an awful lot about this, so there are people who've done an awful lot better job than me talking about residence time distribution. But what I would say is from an automation point of view, this is, again, really important, but it's really important for us to understand batch definition. Where does a batch start? Where does a batch end? Where potentially does it cross over? So then it helps us track, or for material tracking. It also helps with the frequency of analytical equipment, knowing how quickly a product is moving through a system. So one of the key attributes of controlling the process. Similar thing with validation. We've suggested a two-step approach to that, where each unit is validated in its own right, using their local multivariable control. But once that's been satisfied and that's been done, is to do a complete end-to-end validation, where we use the predictive control to understand the overall impact of retaining a steady state through the whole system. And then the vision certainly for the PAT system, but for automation, is once it's all completely embedded, you get the visualization of quality prediction, so we're making the information available to operators in order to help them make the right, not just our decision, but the right decision at the right time. But also fault detection, so statistically abnormal operation, they're alerted to that, but it's all in the same place on the same interface. So a bit of an overview of automation.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think we have time for a few questions. Yes.
Hi, thank you for this great overview. I wonder, did Emerson ever make an overview of the business case impact of this? So suppose that 5 years in the future, we would have a system that is fully DCS and has all the benefits that you explain. How would cost evolve in that case? Would it be more expensive but easier over time, or would the investment be lower? How would you see business cases evolve?
So that's a great question, and we challenge ourselves to that very point internally as well. And I think the answer to it is that's probably not as mature as we would like it to be. The first answer is that it needs to be a holistic system where that's probably not quite there yet. And largely because the technology is moving at such a rate, then you'll make your blueprint for that solution, and it will evolve, it will change. I think as well, we looked at it from not from a cost perspective, but a value perspective. So it's likely that the cost of implementing a complete system would be more, but the value and the benefit it brings you would be increased. So the ROI on that will be there, but it won't be as cheap as just buying a DCS solution. But it's something that we've recognised is that we need to do that. It's also aligned to we're working on at the moment is when we talk about automation and we talk about process and manufacturing, and it's become prevalent in the last 2 days. What does the roadmap look like as well? So there are not just Emerson, but automation generally. There are things that you can buy off the shelf now, and they will answer and they will meet the functional requirements. But process continuous manufacturing is moving at a rate of knots. So is automation. So what does the roadmap look like, and how does it align to those functional and business requirements?
If we can work together with a few industry partners and yourself to try to estimate roadmap and the cost benefit.
Yeah, for sure. I think that would be perfect.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, thank you very much, Alan. I appreciate your presentation.